It begins, as many reckonings do, in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that precedes a shattering, a silence full of pressure. In the mid-19th century, Japan stood still, deliberately, stubbornly, gracefully, on the precipice of modernity, its feet planted in centuries-old soil while the world beyond it roared forward in steel and steam. The Tokugawa Shogunate had sealed the nation like a scroll, folded against time, believing that purity could be preserved through isolation. For over 200 years, Japan resisted the fever of industrial expansion, content, perhaps doomed, to remain a world of rice fields and ritual, sword and shrine. But the horizon was bending, and the silence was breaking. Outside the archipelago, empires were devouring oceans, railways spread like veins across continents, cannons manufactured not by smiths but by machines, thundered from Western navies. In England, coal dust mingled with ambition. In the Americas, industry married conquest. And in the shadow of that storm, Japan felt time tugging at its robes, polite at first, then insistent, then violent. This is not a story of catching up. It is a story of rupture, of a nation forced to choose, dissolve into irrelevance, or shatter its own reflection. To understand the Meiji Miracle, one must first see what stood before the miracle. A world thick with etiquette and slowness, where the position of the sun, not the ticking of clocks, told time, where daimyo lords ruled scattered fiefs like miniature kingdoms, and the samurai class, 2 million strong, lived by codes that had calcified into myth. It was a world designed not for progress, but for permanence. And yet, the permanence was a kind of dream. Beautiful, yes, but brittle. Then came the ships, black as ink, breathing smoke and fire. Commodore Perry's squadron arrived in 1853, like omens from a god Japan no longer worshipped. They didn't knock, they loomed. And with them came not just trade agreements, but time itself. Accelerated, foreign, merciless. Within months, the spell of isolation cracked. Treaties were signed under duress. Ports opened. Foreigners stepped ashore. The Japanese called them the Kurofune, black ships. But more than ships, they were mirrors. They reflected a future Japan had not asked to see. There are stories, almost too symbolic to be real, that capture this moment. One tells of a Kyoto nobleman who, upon hearing of the Western arrival, burned his family's ancestral swords in shame. Another of a child in Edo who mistook a foreign sailor for a ghost, because his red hair and cannon, like voice, did not fit into the cosmology she'd been taught. These are not anecdotes. They are symptoms of a national psyche on the verge of fragmentation. Disorientation set in like fog. What was the shape of Japan now? Was the emperor a god or a relic? Could a samurai wield a ledger instead of a blade? Could rice-fed islands compete with iron-fed empires? The questions had no answers yet, only tremors, and still the instinct to endure stirred. Beneath the confusion, a more ancient current moved. Japan had always been a nation of adaptation, not mimicry, but transformation. Buddhism was once foreign, so was Chinese script. Even the imperial institution had, at times, been more symbol than sovereign. The archipelago had swallowed invaders not through resistance, but absorption. It reshaped what entered, made it Japanese. But never before had the incoming tide been so fast, so loud, so absolute. To live, Japan would have to unmake itself, surgically, violently, purposefully. And that meant something more painful than war. It meant killing parts of its own reflection. The rusted armor, the rigid castes, the medieval economy, the sacred stagnation. Transformation is not a clean line. It is a rupture wrapped in grief. And for those who lived on the cusp of it, the fear was not just of the foreign, but of becoming unrecognizable to oneself. In a temple outside Nara, an elder monk wrote in 1854, "The gods have gone quiet. The trees whisper strange songs. I no longer know if the rice I plant will feed Japan or some other hunger." He did not live to see the revolution, but he heard the bell before it rang. This was the edge of time. Not a moment, but a pressure point. One foot rooted in memory, the other pulled toward a destiny shaped in foreign foundries. Japan did not leap forward. It was dragged, sobbing and furious, toward its own rebirth. And when it finally moved, it did so with the precision of a blade and the cold resolve of necessity. The silence had ended. The bell was about to ring. And yet, within the trembling stillness of Japan's pre-Meiji twilight, there was something far more unnerving than the sound of foreign cannons. Something internal, ancestral, and unspeakable. The realization that Japan's greatest threat was not the West, but time itself. Because time had betrayed the country. It had moved for others, but not for Japan. And now it returned. Vengeful, impatient, pulling generations forward as if to punish them for daring to remain still. What had once been sacred now felt brittle. The very institutions that gave life meaning, clan, caste, calendar, began to shimmer with unreality, as though history itself was withdrawing its favor. In villages untouched by foreigners, change still arrived like an invisible current. The prices of rice shifted inexplicably. Strange coins replaced familiar ones. Young men disappeared to study abroad, returning with machine eyes and foreign words. Even the seasons, once so faithful, began to feel unreliable. Monsoons came early. Harvest soared. Old farmers muttered of omens. A poem scratched into the wall of a Kyoto bathhouse in 1856 reads, "The water boils faster but does not cleanse us. The mirror no longer shows my face. Go only a mask I do not remember putting on." There was fear, yes, but it was not the fear of conquest. It was the deeper terror of vanishing, of being swept into history without leaving a shape behind. This is where the resistance began, not with violence, but with clinging. Entire communities wrapped themselves tighter in ritual. Samurai shaved their heads and became monks. Merchants commissioned family crests in stone, desperate to preserve lineages. Midwives whispered Shinto prayers twice as loud, as if to call the gods back down from the mountains. But the gods, if they were listening, had already changed their dialect. Still, even in resistance, Japan showed its paradoxical genius. It never sought to freeze entirely. Rather, it looked for a way to control the thaw. And here the story begins to shift, not toward capitulation, but toward an act of collective theater so profound it bordered on myth-making, the nation's decision to orchestrate its own disassembly. A quiet consensus, forged not through votes but necessity, began to form in the minds of the elite and the desperate alike. If Japan was to survive, it would need to wear a mask. But it would choose the mask. It would need to mimic the West. But only long enough to become something else. It would learn to become unrecognizable to the world, just long enough to remain recognizable to itself. The last generation before the Meiji Restoration did not sleep peacefully. They stood at the edge of time, staring down a century they did not understand, unable to turn back. But they held one truth tightly, like a prayer folded inside a kimono sleeve, that nothing truly sacred is destroyed in transformation. It only changes shape. And so, a nation began to bow, not in submission, but in preparation. Time in Tokugawa Japan did not tick, it bowed. It moved not in linear thrust, but in loops, rituals, and rhythms. The year was not a race, but a dance. The shogunate's world was one of layered stillness, where status was inherited, roles were eternal, and history curved gently backward as often as forward. To live in Tokugawa society was to live inside a clock wound by custom, whose hands moved not by force, but by form. The bells that rang in temples were not warnings. They were confirmations that all was, for the moment, as it should be. Beneath the surface, though this stillness had a sharp edge, the Tokugawa peace was not the absence of violence. It was the control of it. The sword had been sheathed, but not forgotten. Samurai walked the streets with pride and purpose, but no wars left to fight. Merchants grew wealthy in secret, forbidden to display their riches. Farmers bore the weight of a tax system designed to keep them productive, obedient and silent. Everyone had their place, and no one dared climb. Time did not belong to the individual. It belonged to the order. And that order was sacred. Or so it claimed. At the center of it all stood Edo, a city of paper screens and floating worlds, where pleasure districts buzzed beside Confucian academies, and the illusion of permanence was rehearsed each day like a play that could not end. Calendars were based on lunar movement, not factory schedules. Workdays followed the sun. Even the measurement of hours shifted with the seasons. Longer daylight meant longer hours. Time was elastic, poetic, alive. But beneath the poetry, entropy brewed. The world was changing outside the walls. Empires mapped continents, guns replaced bows, machines replaced hands. And in Japan, the ritual clock was starting to slip. Famine came. Earthquakes followed. Rebellion sparked like brush fires, quickly stamped out, but never fully extinguished. Even within the ruling elite, the question whispered, could this stillness hold? One story lingers like a ghost from the final years before the fall. A daimyo in northern Honshu received a gift from a Dutch trader at a mechanical clock, precise to the second, unaffected by sun or season. He placed it beside his traditional Japanese clock, which measured time in the ancient seasonal method. The two clocks diverged quickly. One marched forward with metronomic indifference. The other bent and yielded to light, to ritual, to past. After 3 days, the daimyo threw both into a koi pond. He declared, "Let the fish decide the future." It is not a story of ignorance. It is a story of paralysis. Because deep down, many in Tokugawa Japan knew that the world had moved on. But to admit it was to risk unraveling everything. Family lines, moral codes, the illusion that Japan, untouched by time, could still shape it. The Tokugawa era is often remembered as a golden cage. Peaceful, ordered, civilized. But every cage, no matter how gilded, is built to keep something out, or something in. The Meiji Restoration would later be hailed as a miracle of national rebirth. But what came before it was not chaos. It was something far stranger, a nation that chose to sleep inside a dream of constancy, while the future tapped, then pounded, at its gates. What broke the Tokugawa spell wasn't violence. It was time itself, arriving not as metaphor, but as machinery. And once that machinery entered, the old rituals would be torn from their roots. Not by hatred, but by necessity. But not because they were wrong, but because they no longer answered the right questions. The Tokugawa clock had stopped, and the next hand to rise would strike, not chime. To the casual observer, Tokugawa Japan might have appeared timeless. The stillness of its temples, the rhythm of its rice harvests, the repetition of gestures handed down across generations. It all gave the impression of a civilization content to remain exactly as it was. But that stillness was not peace. It was structure, a tightly choreographed arrangement of roles, hierarchies, and obligations designed less to encourage life than to contain it. The ritual clock of Tokugawa life was less an invention of gears than of ideology. Time belonged not to the self but to the system. A merchant might be richer than a samurai, but he would bow nonetheless. A farmer could read the stars but not own his land. Progress was not forbidden. But it was disguised, buried beneath layers of formality, dressed in the garments of tradition, so it could walk unnoticed. And yet, human desire has never been content with stasis. Beneath the lacquered politeness of the era, things moved. Not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. Scholars translated Dutch texts in secret. Smugglers ferried foreign goods through hidden coves. Peasants, once content to bow, began to ask questions. Why must we pay so much rice to men who no longer fight? Why does the law serve the past, and not the hungry? The cracks in the Tokugawa order were not explosions. They were hairline fractures invisible unless you knew where to look. In Kyoto, a no performer added a foreign gesture to his routine. Not because anyone asked him to, but because it felt right. In Osaka, a clockmaker crafted hybrid devices. Part Western, part Japanese, not to defy tradition, but to feel the world turning more precisely beneath his hands. Change whispered first, but it did not stay quiet. Because time, once bent, does not unbend, and the Tokugawa order, graceful though it was, had no mechanism for revolution. It had ceremony instead of contingency, reverence instead of reinvention. Its greatest strength, its ability to ritualize every layer of life, became its deepest vulnerability when the rituals lost their relevance. There is something tragic in systems that resist time. Not because they are wrong, but because they believe they are eternal. In one of the final winters before the fall of the shogunate, an aging Confucian scholar wrote in his journal, "I feel as though I live inside a painting. Beautiful, yes, but unmoving. And the brush is now in someone else's hand." He died the following spring, just before the painting was torn in two. The Tokugawa clock did not break in a single moment. It was not shattered by gunfire or toppled by mobs. It stopped because the world outside began to move too quickly, and Japan, elegant, precise, unyielding, could no longer pretend it wasn't standing still. It began not with a declaration, but with smoke on the horizon. On a summer morning in 1853, villagers near Raga Harbor paused mid-task. Fishermen stopped gutting their catch. Children froze mid-play. Monks halted mid-chant. All eyes turned to the water. Something unnatural approached. Towering, dark-hulled ships, coughing smoke and flame, glided across the waves like creatures from a myth not written in Japanese. They were not vessels, they were omens. The people called them Kurofune, the black ships. Commodore Matthew Perry's arrival was neither invitation nor accident. It was intrusion, staged with imperial choreography. Cannons gleamed beneath sails. Decks stood rigid with uniformed men whose gaze did not waver. Behind them loomed a new world, not just of Western nations, but of Western time, measured in industry, in profit, in war. Japan had no navy to match them, no weapons to defy them, and no illusions to hide behind anymore. The seal of isolation, once the source of Japan's sovereignty, now became its vulnerability. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa Shogunate had kept the world at arm's length, out of fear, out of pride, out of principle. Foreigners were banned. Christianity was outlawed. Trade was confined to Nagasaki's tiny man-made island, Dejima, where Dutch merchants were permitted only under strict surveillance. This closed-door policy wasn't mere paranoia, it was policy as metaphysics. The idea that Japan could remain pure, culturally intact, socially ordered, by controlling what came in and what went out. But Perry's fleet was not asking to come in. It was daring Japan to stay closed. When his envoy delivered the letter from President Millard Fillmore, equal parts negotiation and threat, it was placed on a black lacquered tray, carried by trembling hands to Edo. There, the shogunate trembled too. They understood immediately this was not just about trade. It was about time itself catching up. The West wasn't asking permission. It was setting terms. What unfolded in the months that followed was not simply diplomatic, it was existential. The Bakufu's ministers debated not only policy but fate. Could the samurai code survive railroads? Could shrines stand beside factories? Could the sacred order be upheld when the sky itself now held iron birds? And the people. They watched, waited, murmured. Rumors bloomed like mold that the foreigners had golden eyes, that their ships ran on whale oil and souls, that they had maps where Japan was drawn small and fading. Fear turned inward. In Kyoto, a samurai slashed a paper lantern bearing a western crest. In Edo, a merchant smashed his own telescope, fearing it made him disloyal. These were not protests, they were gestures of helplessness. But not all were afraid. A small faction, quiet, ambitious, furious, began to stir. Among them were young samurai from Chashi and Satsuma, scholars of Rangaku Dutch learning, and Ronin without lords. They saw in the black ships not humiliation, but a mirror. A vision of what Japan might become. Not Western, but awakened. The ships had arrived not simply to threaten, they had arrived to reveal. And what they revealed was that Japan, as it stood, could not endure the coming century without reinventing itself. This was the beginning of the philosophical fracture. The moment when preservation and obliteration first locked eyes. Perry's return in 1854 only deepened the wound. This time he brought more ships, more firepower, and less patience. The Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, unequal, reluctant, irreversible. 2 ports were opened, consulates were agreed upon, and with a stroke of the brush, centuries of seclusion were undone. But what was truly signed away that day was not sovereignty, it was certainty. The black ships did not conquer Japan with war. They conquered with tempo. They brought clocks that did not bow to seasons, ships that did not wait for wind, economies that did not tolerate pause. They brought the machinery of modernity, and with it, a new measure of power. One diary entry from a retainer in Edo captures the fracture in simple terms. We looked upon their ships and felt smaller than we had ever known ourselves to be. But still, I wondered, what if we too could build such things? The awe had begun, and beneath the awe, the hunger, because even as the black ships left port, their smoke remained. It stained the sky. It etched itself into policy, into poems, into memory. The seal was broken, and the question now, no longer avoidable, was not whether Japan would change, but who would be allowed to shape that change. The signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa was quiet. Too quiet, some said. No blood spilled, no walls toppled, no cannons fired. Just parchment, signatures, and a silence that spread across the archipelago like ash. But make no mistake, it was an invasion. Not of territory, but of tempo. In that moment, Japan ceased to be a sealed world. The black ships had not just pried open its harbors, they had cleaved open its future. What followed was not yet the Meiji Restoration. That would come years later, through fire and factional struggle, but the seal was already broken, and with it, the Tokugawa spell that had held Japan in its tightly choreographed suspension. Now, the currents of change surged inward. Not just foreign goods, sugar, clocks, wool, but foreign ideas, technologies, alphabets, metaphysics. What had once been kept out of sight now arrived by the ton, in crates and books, in men who spoke languages Japan had no names for, and with each arrival came a deeper kind of dissonance. In 1855, an American steam engine was brought to Japan. A small model, no more than a few meters of track. It was paraded through Edo with great curiosity. People gathered by the hundreds to see it. Children ran alongside it. Elders squinted in disbelief. One account tells of a former samurai who bowed before it, uncertain whether it was a tool or a spirit. It wasn't just a machine. It was a prophecy wrapped in iron and noise. And everyone could feel it. This was not just new. This was unstoppable. The warrior's world, built on stillness and order, was now echoing with movement it could neither control nor contain. The tension was not merely political. It was metaphysical. The samurai, once the arbiters of violence, now stood bewildered before machines that obeyed no code but efficiency. A sword, after all, must be drawn by a human hand. But a steam engine moves because it must. This was the true thunder of the black ships, not their guns but their implications. Japan was not simply being opened. It was being accelerated. And acceleration is violence of a different sort. It doesn't break bones. It breaks continuity. For a culture rooted in centuries of careful layering, of poetry, of protocol, of ancestry, this was nothing less than a spiritual rupture. Elders could no longer guide the young. Monks could no longer answer questions about the future. Even the seasons, once a trusted rhythm, seemed irrelevant now that steamships could defy tides. Many resisted. Peasant revolts flared. Anti-foreign sentiment boiled in the cities. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, became the cry of the disillusioned, a plea not just for purity, but for control over the shape of tomorrow. But even the most zealous could not unsee what had been seen. The black ships had carried more than threat. They had carried proof that another world existed, that another Japan might be possible. In a remote village outside Satsuma, a young boy watched a Western missionary demonstrate a simple electric light. Years later, that boy, Hirobumi, would become one of the architects of modern Japan. But in that moment, he saw not electricity. He saw a world being redrawn. The spark was not in the wire. It was in the mind. And this is the paradox at the heart of the Meiji Miracle. Japan did not modernize by mimicking the West. It modernized by confronting its reflection. First with fear, then with precision. The black ships were not gods, but they were messengers. What they carried was neither salvation nor destruction. They carried a question. Will you remain what you are, and vanish? Or will you become something else, and survive? The answer would demand sacrifice. It would require abandoning comfort, burning sacred texts, unlearning inherited roles. But it would also require vision. A new kind of imagination. One that could hold contradiction without collapse. One that could place a sword beside a steam engine and call it a nation. The still waters had been broken. Thunder had echoed across the islands. And now, something deeper was stirring beneath the waves. The chrysanthemum, the imperial flower of Japan, is a symbol of grace, order, and eternal return. Its petals unfold in perfect symmetry, circling a radiant center, disciplined and whole. But by the late 1850s, the petals were fraying. Not torn by enemies from abroad, but by a tremor spreading from within. The seal of isolation had cracked under the weight of black ships, but now it was the soul of Japan itself that began to fissure. The Tokugawa Shogunate, once the architect of peace, found itself incapable of commanding the present. Its bureaucracy was thick with tradition but thin on action. Its samurai administrators could enforce loyalty but not adaptability. Its very power, the power to still time, had become its greatest weakness. As foreign treaties multiplied and foreign faces appeared in Yokohama and Nagasaki, the old order found itself suspended between ritual and rupture. The court in Kyoto and the bakufu in Edo began to speak two languages, neither of which could yet articulate the future. One clung to sacred ancestry, the other to procedural habit. Neither could stop the unraveling. There was no single moment when the Tokugawa regime collapsed. There were only fractures, deepening, multiplying, echoing. Peasants rioted under the weight of new taxes and old grievances. Samurai, stripped of purpose, drifted into economic despair or militant idealism. The currency destabilized. Rice prices swung with the wind. And everywhere questions lingered with no safe answers. Who speaks for Japan? Who protects its essence? And if the old forms are failing, what shape should the new ones take? The shogunate attempted reforms, half-hearted, too late. The Ansei reforms of the early 1860s opened arsenals in schools, tried to modernize military training, even reached out to Western engineers. But these gestures, meant to restore confidence, only revealed how far behind the center had fallen. The reforms had the rhythm of mimicry, not mastery. In the countryside, former retainers of minor domains gathered in secret, in Satsuma, Chashet, Tosa, far from the fading glow of Edo's authority. Men sharpened swords and studied steam engines with equal focus. They didn't yet agree on ideology, only that something sacred had rotted, and something new must be born, not gently, not gradually, but through fire. In 1860, one symbolic spark erupted: the assassination of Ieyasu Naosuke, a senior counselor to the shogun who had championed the opening of Japan. He was killed by disgruntled samurai at the Sakurada Gate, his blood staining the snow. His murderers bowed before striking. It was not just revenge. It was ritual rebellion, a final gesture of devotion twisted into defiance. This was the paradox of collapse in Japan. It was not wild, but composed. The old order died not with a scream, but with a bow and a whispered poem. Even its rebels wore formality like armor. A chrysanthemum does not break. It withers from the center. And by the early 1860s, the emperor, once a figurehead, began to glow with renewed symbolic power. The court in Kyoto, long overshadowed by Edo's shogunate, became a rallying point for those who believed that Japan's past must be reclaimed in order to invent its future. Not because the emperor held real power, yet, but because he embodied something that could not be outsourced: the soul of the nation. And that soul was being fought over. In the streets of Edo, fires broke out. Anti-foreign violence surged, then was crushed, then returned again in whispers. In the ports, merchants quietly welcomed Western buyers, even as mobs outside burned effigies of foreign devils. Japan was not unified in purpose. It was being pulled apart by competing dreams, one clinging to ritual, another racing toward reinvention. By the time the shogun resigned in 1867, there was little left to rule. Authority had become costume. The title of shogun would survive only one more year. And then, like a mask removed in the final act of a no performance, the illusion would fall away. And yet, this was not the end. It was the inhalation before the cry. Because collapse, in Japan's case, was not destruction. It was ignition. By the winter of 1866, the snow fell differently in Edo. It was not just the end of a season. It was the end of an age. Men still bowed in the street. Women still lit incense at altars. But behind their eyes, something had shifted. Reverence had given way to uncertainty. The rituals were performed, but not believed in the same way. Japan was still Japan, but its center no longer held. And the chrysanthemum, that ancient symbol of imperial order, now bore hairline fractures in its golden geometry. The collapse of the Tokugawa Shogunate was not a single moment. It was an unraveling. Like silk pulled from a loom, threads of loyalty, duty, and identity frayed slowly, then all at once. The structures were intact, but hollowed. The halls of government echoed with titles that no longer commanded fear. Edicts were issued and ignored. Samurai stipends were unpaid. Daimyo bowed to the capital with one hand and reached for rifles with the other. Edo, for all its lanterns and measured canals, had become a theater staging the final act of a play whose script no longer matched the audience. In the rural provinces, where the machinery of power always arrives last, rumors moved faster than soldiers. In one village near Tottori, a storyteller revised an old folktale to end with a foreign steamship eating the moon. Children laughed. Elders didn't. The allegory was clear. The natural order was devouring itself. Even the weather seemed complicit. The typhoon season came early. Crops failed. A solar eclipse darkened the sky over Satsuma, prompting a local priest to declare, "The heavens have lost their calendar." But it wasn't the gods who had lost track of time. It was the old regime. Amid the wreckage of governance, a younger generation began to rise. Not just in age, but in conviction. They had seen the black ships. They had studied Dutch science, translated German philosophy, smuggled French weapons. They were not revolutionaries in the Western sense. They were resurrectionists. What they sought was not a new Japan, but a Japan reborn through new vessels. The soul would remain, they believed, but the body must change. This belief, that one could sever form from essence, and still preserve meaning, is what allowed the Meiji Revolution to proceed with such violent elegance. It was not about destroying Japan. It was about reinterpreting it. The court in Kyoto would return, not to reclaim power, but to legitimize a new vision. The emperor, barely more than a whisper for 2 centuries, would be lifted like a banner, not just for loyalty, but for velocity. And yet, in this pivot from old to new there was grief. Profound private grief. Thousands of samurai born into a code that no longer had currency, walked away from their titles with silent humiliation. Many turned to alcohol, some to prayer, a few to the sword. In the port of Kobe, a young retainer reportedly burned his armor beside his family shrine. He wrote only one line before disappearing: "There is no war left to fight that does not kill something sacred." This was the price of transformation. Not just political upheaval, but spiritual estrangement. The death of a worldview. The erosion of memory. But in that grief, there was also clarity. If the old order had collapsed, it meant there was space to build. And if the past could not hold the future, it would have to be reimagined. Not discarded, but melted down and recast. In that crucible, the Meiji Miracle would take shape. Not as a triumph of imitation, but as an audacious act of national authorship. The chrysanthemum would bloom again, but its petals would now be edged with iron. He had been there the whole time, cloaked in ritual, walled in by ceremony, almost mythical in distance. The Emperor of Japan was not gone, but hidden. For over a millennium, he had sat at the spiritual summit of the nation, a presence felt more than seen, invoked in poems, bowed to in abstraction. While shoguns ruled and swords clashed, the imperial line endured in stillness, its authority symbolic, its body secluded. But now, in the tremor following the collapse of the Tokugawa world, silence began to speak again. And in that silence, the emperor returned. But not as a man, he returned as a mirror. It was 1868, the first year of Meiji, meaning enlightened rule. A phrase chosen with intention. It promised both illumination and structure, a signal to the world that something ancient was awakening through the machinery of the new. The boy emperor, just 15 years old, was carried not into a palace, but into a nation being rewritten. His face was porcelain, his expression unreadable. But his presence, carefully curated, guarded, exalted, became the axis around which the new Japan would begin to spin. This was not a coronation. It was an invention, because the Meiji emperor was not simply restored, he was reimagined. No longer the quiet custodian of ritual calendars and bloodline scrolls, he was now cast in the mold of a sovereign for esteem, powered age modern, divine and necessary. His name would be printed in textbooks, his portrait hung in schoolrooms, his edicts engraved on steel. He would wear Western military uniforms not to mimic, but to declare. Japan would modernize in its own image, and the image would be his. This symbolic transformation was radical and dangerously effective. It masked rupture with continuity. It recast a centuries-old figurehead into the face of a revolutionary project. The emperor became both god and gear, spirit and state, and in doing so, he united a fractured people, not by his voice, which remained rarely heard, but by his silhouette, which appeared everywhere. There is something almost surreal in the silence that surrounded him. While politicians argued and factories rose, the emperor remained still, above politics, untouched by contradiction. He traveled in sealed carriages. His meals were prepared with near religious precision. His eyes, even in paintings, looked past the viewer. He did not lead, he allowed others to act in his name. And that made him perfect, not because he ruled, but because he symbolized without error. The effect was hypnotic. In Hiroshima, a former samurai wrote to his estranged father, "I do not understand the government. I do not understand the machines. But I believe in the emperor, because he does not look confused." It was belief not in a person, but in a possibility. The return of the emperor was less a restoration than a recoding. He was transformed into a sacred machine, one that could reconcile past and future, ritual and railroads. Through him, Japan could believe it had not betrayed itself, only rediscovered its true form beneath the dust of feudal decay. And yet, this transformation was not bloodless. To crown a new center, many things had to be discentered. Regional lords were stripped of autonomy. Temples lost influence. Old texts were burned. A new calendar was adopted. The imperial rescript on education would demand not just obedience, but a fusion of filial piety and state loyalty so profound it blurred the line between morality and law. The emperor's silence echoed through all of it. He did not condemn. He did not bless. He endured. He allowed. And in that allowance, the architects of Meiji built a myth. But beneath that myth, something enduring stirred. Not blind nationalism, not mechanical obedience, but the reforging of an identity. Not by erasing history, but by folding it, like steel, into new shape. The emperor was not the old soul of Japan. He was the mask that allowed that soul to survive transformation. A nation fractured by crisis had found its axis. Not in reason, not even in policy, but in reverence. The boy who said almost nothing became the man who embodied everything. In the newly christened capital of Tokyo, a city still reshaping itself from the ashes of Edo, the emperor sat behind layers, a fabric of distance, of myth. He was rarely seen, almost never heard, yet his image began to multiply on coins, on banners, in textbooks written by men who had never stood in his presence. Children bowed to portraits of him every morning before reciting the virtues of sacrifice, harmony, loyalty to family, and loyalty to him. But what they were bowing to was not just a ruler. It was a narrative stitched from contradiction. This boy crowned in silence became the living justification for a revolution without precedent. The samurai class was abolished in his name. Railways were laid across the archipelago under the banner of imperial progress. The national anthem was written not as a rallying cry for war, but as a hymn to timelessness, a plea that the emperor's reign would last 1,000, 8,000 generations. Yet beneath the poetry, time was accelerating unnaturally. Centuries of social order dissolved in decades. And while the emperor's stillness projected continuity, it disguised the sheer velocity of what was unfolding. The contradictions were profound. A sacred figurehead now presided over the most secular transformation Japan had ever known. A god-king whose power came not from command, but from compliance. His silence enabled everything, from the modernization of the military to the suppression of uprisings. His divine aura justified both tradition and its undoing. He was above politics, and yet, he legitimized every political act. And so, he became the perfect mirror. The people saw in him what they needed to survive the rupture. To the old, he was the last link to ancient Japan. To the young, he was a symbol of national awakening. To the farmers, he was a divine protector. To the industrialists, he was a mask of unity they could wrap around imported steel and foreign capital. Everyone projected. He reflected. And in this endless recursion of symbol and need, the emperor transcended himself. He became more than human, but less than individual. In this space, between presence and projection, lay the real genius of Meiji authority. Japan, battered by external pressures and internal upheaval, did not fall into chaos. Instead, it rotated around a symbol strong enough to absorb contradiction without collapse. The emperor didn't resolve tensions. He held them. One Meiji Era poet captured this with aching clarity. He speaks not, yet we hear him. He moves not, yet we follow. He weeps not, so we do it for him. This was reverence, but it was also burden. The cost of this collective projection was real. The emperor bore it in silence, and the people bore it in transformation. It was not forced, but it was not free. It demanded that memory be rewritten, that pain be reinterpreted as progress, that the violence of loss be softened by meth. And yet, through all of this, something astonishing happened. The Japanese spirit did not vanish in modernization. It became articulate. Through the emperor, as symbol, the country discovered a way to burn down the scaffolding of the past without burning the sacred center. In a world where most nations modernized by abandoning their identity, Japan reinvented itself by folding identity inward, like origami, compressed, elegant, indestructible. The return of the emperor was not a return at all. It was a repositioning, a sacred rupture sealed in ritual, a new center crowned not with noise, but with the silence of inevitability. In the old Japan, a sword was not just a weapon, it was a soul. It symbolized duty, blood, and the sacred geometry of a life devoted to service. A samurai's blade was his honor, his identity, and in many ways, his clock. It marked the rhythm of life and the silence of death. But in the Meiji era, the sound of clashing steel was drowned out by something louder, colder, and less personal. The hiss of steam, the crack of gunfire, the mechanical hum of transformation. The military, once the exclusive domain of the warrior class, was being dismantled and rebuilt from the bones outward. What emerged was not a refined extension of tradition, but a rupture dressed in uniform. In 1873, Japan instituted conscription. All males, regardless of birth, now belonged to the nation, not to a clan. For the samurai, this was heresy. For the state, it was necessity. It dissolved centuries of hierarchy in a single decree and rewrote the meaning of loyalty, no longer to lord or lineage, but to emperor and empire. But conscription was only the surface. Beneath it, Japan was constructing a war machine with borrowed blueprints and native urgency. The French taught drills. The Germans sent manuals. The British sold ships. And Japanese officers watched, learned, absorbed, then adapted. The aim was not to copy but to integrate, to forge a uniquely Japanese doctrine from foreign components, much like the ancient swordsmiths who folded steel upon steel to create something stronger than its source. In the foundries of Yokosuka, smokestacks rose where once rice paddies had swayed. Ironclads were assembled bolt by bolt, towering symbols of a country forcing itself into relevance. What had taken Western nations generations to develop, Japan pursued in a handful of years. There was urgency. There was desperation. There was vision. And yet, the human cost of this transformation was severe. Samurai who refused to surrender their swords were labeled dissidents. Many were stripped of their stipends, their status, and their meaning. Some became bureaucrats. Others opened sake shops. A few, unable to adapt, turned to violence. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 was not a war between armies. It was a funeral for a class. Led by Seige Takamori, one of the Meiji government's own architects turned martyr, thousands of disenfranchised warriors rose against the very modernity they had once helped ignite. They marched in traditional armor, wielding swords against rifles, cavalry against artillery. It was not a battle. They were already ghosts. When the rebellion was crushed, it was not celebrated with triumph. It was mourned. Even in victory, there was grief. Takamori's death marked more than the end of resistance. It marked the end of a worldview. And yet the empire marched on. In a matter of decades, Japan's military became a force feared by nations that had once viewed it as ornamental. In 1894, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. 10 years later, it would defeat Russia, an empire that symbolized Western power. These were not mere victories, they were declarations. Japan was no longer a passive student. It had graduated, violently, into its own kind of authority. But buried in these victories was something more complex, a question of identity. What does it mean to become strong by unmaking who you were? To replace the arc of a blade with the recoil of a cannon. To trade ceremonial oaths for field manuals. To raise children who learn war in classrooms, not temples. One soldier, returning from the front, wrote, "I wore a Western coat, carried a German rifle, and fought in the emperor's name. But in the silence before battle, I still whispered my ancestors' names. I do not know what part of me remains." This is the heart of the Meiji military miracle. Not just its efficiency, but its complexity. Japan succeeded not by abandoning its soul, but by reforging it in fire and industry. The sword became a metaphor, the uniform became a vessel, and the nation itself became a weapon forged for survival. Transformation had not been clean. It had been violent, personal, and sacrificial. But it had been real. The transformation of Japan's military was never merely logistical. It was existential. It was not just new uniforms, new arsenals, new tactics. It was a recalibration of the spirit, a reckoning with violence itself. In the past, a sword was drawn not only in combat, but in ceremony and poetry and death. Now, war had become industrialized, loud, unceremonious, systemic. What once carried metaphysical weight now fired from breech-loaded rifles, dispassionate and repeatable. And this was both the triumph and the tragedy of modernization, the act of becoming powerful by learning how to forget. At the heart of this transformation was an idea even more radical than conscription, that anyone could be a soldier. Not just samurai born into a warrior code, but farmers, laborers, merchants. Men whose ancestors had been told their hands were too stained with rice, too burdened by trade, to ever carry arms for the nation. The Meiji government turned this exclusion on its head. The call to arms became a call to unity. The rifle, unlike the katana, made no distinction between bloodlines. And so the imperial army became a paradox, a machine made of men taught to worship tradition while embodying rupture. It is easy to celebrate the efficiency of this evolution. How Japan built steel battleships in dry docks that barely existed a decade earlier. How it trained officers fluent in Prussian command structures and Confucian ethics. But what's harder to face is the human cost hidden inside this speed. For every success story, every battlefield victory, every foreign headline hailing the rise of the East, there was a silence at home. A father returning from drills who no longer recognized his son, a widow asked to accept the death of her husband not for clan or village, but for a concept too large to touch Kaka, the modern nation. Even language had to evolve. The very word for army, gun, shifted from describing local samurai bands to a centralized, bureaucratized instrument of policy. In military academies, cadets were taught to think strategically, not honorably, to plan for objectives, not destinies, to win, and win they did. But with each victory, the echo of something older, something more human, faded. The ritual had not disappeared, but it had changed its clothing. A general in pressed Western uniform now bowed to the emperor's portrait before battle, just as a samurai might have bowed to his ancestral shrine. The gesture survived, the meanings evolved. One letter, preserved in the archives of the Ministry of War, written by a young conscript during the Russo-Japanese War, reads, "They say I fight for the emperor. But I fight because I must. The rifle is heavy, the uniform tight. Sometimes I dream of my father's farm. In the morning light, I see steam rising from the engine, and I wonder, are we being fed to the machine we built?" It is a haunting question, and an honest one, because the military reforging of Japan was not just about defense or deterrence. It was about identity. It was about forcing the soul of a warrior nation into a modern shell without breaking it. Or at least, without letting the cracks show. And perhaps that is where the deeper courage lay, not in the firepower, but in the willingness to walk this narrow bridge between what was sacred and what was necessary, between sword and steam, between the poetry of the past and the precision of the future. In that crossing, Japan discovered not just how to fight, but how to endure. The uniform came with buttons, boots, and silence. It replaced robes stitched by generations with foreign fabrics sewn in haste. It bore no family crest, no sign of province or clan. It smelled of starch and steel, and when worn it turned farmers into soldiers, artisans into enforcers, sons into instruments. It was called progress. But for those who put it on, it often felt like disappearance. Modernization, especially in military form, has a strange way of erasing the very people it promises to empower. It gives them new names, recruit, cadet, infantryman, but asks them to forget old ones. For Japan in the Meiji Era, this erasure was not passive. It was purposeful. The state needed a new citizen, loyal not to the memory of a village shrine or to the ghosts of feudal lords, but to the idea of Japan itself, an idea still being forged in fire and contradiction. What was sacrificed for this idea was not just time or treasure, but identity. Conscripts were told they were equal now, unified by the emperor's will, standardized by drill, redeemed by discipline. But equality in the ranks did not erase the wounds it covered. The shift was not just physical, it was psychological. Men who once learned stories of gods and ancestors now learned how to fix bayonets. Where fathers taught sons the curve of the plow, they now taught them how to march. The rituals changed. The stakes did not. And beneath the surface, pain multiplied. In rural hamlets, where rice fields blurred into mountain mist, mothers stood at doorways watching their sons disappear into barracks. Some never returned. Others returned changed, silent, rigid, foreign in their own skin. They brought back medals sometimes, but also fever, alcoholism, rage, and a quiet, unnameable shame. that they had given something they did not know how to recover. One conscript, upon his return to Yamagata, refused to enter his family home. He set up a small tent behind the house, shaved his head, and slept outside even in the snow. When asked why, he said only, "I left a version of myself I cannot invite back." These were not the stories told in state newspapers. Officially, modernization was a miracle. The numbers soared, factories doubled, weapons improved, ships were launched like declarations. And yet, for every iron hull baptized in Tokyo Bay, there were tears in kitchens, prayers said not with pride, but with trembling. The cost of becoming modern was not counted in yen, but in absences, of people, of customs, of belonging, and the wounds went deeper than loss. They struck at language itself. Villagers who once spoke in dialects thick with local rhythm were now required to learn standardized Japanese. In military academies, dialect was punished. In schools, accents were erased. Uniformity was protection, the government said. But in becoming uniform, something vital slipped through the seams. One teacher in Kyoto wrote in her journal, "My students no longer know the names of their grandparents' gods, but they can sing the anthem. I'm not sure which brings more comfort, or more grief." Because grief lived beneath the surface of progress. It was the shadow beneath the smokestack. The echo in the rifle report, the silence after a national anthem ends and no one speaks. But not all wounds were mourned. Some became monuments. In the 1880s, small stone shrines began appearing in towns across Japan, not for the fallen warriors of ancient battles, but for the unknown soldier, the boy who left for Tokyo and never came back. These weren't imperial projects. They were made by neighbors, funded by coins, etched by hand. Simple offerings, not of patriotism, but of remembrance. And in these quiet gestures, something enduring emerged. Modernization had not erased the soul of Japan. It had wounded it, pressed it into shapes unfamiliar, forced it to speak in borrowed tones. But it had not killed it. The soul endured in adaptation. In the grandmother who kept the family sword buried beneath her tatami mats. In the blacksmith who turned his forge to rail parts, but still whispered Shinto prayers as he worked. In the soldier who saluted with one hand and clutched a childhood amulet with the other. The Meiji Miracle was not miraculous because it was painless. It was miraculous because, through pain, it found shape. Through loss, it found memory. And through wounds, it found something worth defending. What was worn on the outside, the uniform, the posture, the polished boots, was only part of the cost. The deeper wounds of modernization lived beneath the fabric, hidden in the bones of the nation, where grief had no anthem and change carried no apology. In the race to catch up with the West, Japan moved faster than perhaps any society in history. But speed is gravity. It distorts time, bends memory, tears things loose from their roots. One generation was born into feudal stillness, the next into industrial velocity. And in between, those caught mid-stride, mid-oath. There was dissonance too deep for language. Take, for example, the story of Ishikawa Daisuke, a young conscript from Nagaida, sent to a distant regiment in Kyushu. He had never left his village before. He had never seen the sea. In his final letter home, he wrote, "My body has learned to march, but my heart has not caught up." He died of illness 2 weeks later. His name is not in history books, but he is there, in every silent photograph, every ghost behind the progress. Modernization did not just erase customs, it rearranged grief. In the old Japan, mourning was collective rituals, chants, incense, lineage. In Meiji Japan, grief became regulated, clean, bureaucratic. Soldiers were buried with ceremony, but not necessarily memory. Industrial war demanded efficiency, even in death. And families were left to grieve within new boundaries. Ones written in policy, rather than poetry. It wasn't only men who bore the burden. Women, mothers, daughters, wives, became the invisible scaffolding of this transformation. They raised sons they would never see again. They sewed uniforms they could not wear. They watched the tools of old life, looms, farming blades, cooking pots, be replaced by things with sharper edges. And all the while they were told this is progress. Be proud, many were. But pride, too, can carry its own ache. One mother in Hiroshima left her son's conscription notice tucked between pages of a sutra. Not out of reverence, out of protection. She believed the scripture might somehow return him home. It didn't. But she continued reading from it every morning, just in case. These are the quiet stories. The ones not sung. But they are not footnotes. They are the foundation. Because modernization is not a machine that runs on steel and coal alone. It runs on belief, on loss transformed into loyalty, on wounds made sacred. The uniforms came, and with them pride, power, possibility, but also silence and shadows. And yet, through all this, something held. A kind of moral alloy, part ritual, part resilience, that allowed Japan not only to modernize, but to survive its own acceleration. It did not erase the past. It reforged it, bent it, stretched it until it could fit into new vessels, speak through new symbols, breathe through new wounds. And in this quiet violence, a new strength was born, not triumphant, not unscarred, but enduring. In the great theaters of the Meiji Era, one performance took place offstage, quiet, relentless, and existential, the act of copying. Western uniforms, Western hairstyles, Western textbooks, Western music. Japan, once the secluded dream of its own design, now stared directly into the mirror of the West. And, to survive, began sketching the outline of another face atop its own. But this was not mimicry born of admiration. It was mimicry born of necessity. The black ships had brought more than foreign goods. They had brought exposure. And in exposure, vulnerability. For Japan to be respected, it first had to be recognized. And to be recognized by the West meant learning to speak in its idioms, walk in its posture, think in its frameworks. Even while carrying an entirely different heart. This was not flattery. It was strategy. To the outside world, it looked like imitation. But to those inside, it was a mask, worn not to hide weakness, but to buy time. Behind that mask, Japan was learning, archiving, translating. Not just ideas, but intentions. Not just techniques, but trajectories. Engineers were sent to Berlin. Naval officers trained in Portsmouth. Ministers walked the halls of the British Parliament. They observed, absorbed, returned. One Meiji statesman described it best in a letter. We must appear Western enough to be left alone. But never forget this is armor, not skin. But the armor came at a cost. Every borrowed institution, every foreign word etched into law or education, came with friction. The language of rights and constitutions had to be negotiated with concepts of duty and harmony. The idea of an individual self clashed with centuries of communal identity. The calendar was changed, hairstyles outlawed. Even architecture was transformed. Wooden temples replaced by brick ministries. Tea houses eclipsed by train stations. Some called it progress, others erasure. In a school outside Yokohama, a Confucian scholar turned teacher was dismissed for refusing to stop reciting the Analects in class. They said my tongue belonged to an empire that no longer exists. He later wrote, but I thought I was still in Japan. And yet, amidst these contradictions, something remarkable unfolded. Japan did not disappear inside the Western gaze. It moved beneath it. Mimicry was not submission. It was subversion. The copying was a performance. And like all great performances, it concealed more than it revealed. Beneath the imported structures, the soul remained agile, watching, weighing. Take the Meiji Constitution of 1889. Modeled after the Prussian system, it seemed on its face like a Western transplant, a modern monarchy with a bicameral legislature. But its wording was elusive, its balance of power intentionally ambiguous. It preserved imperial divinity while nodding toward parliamentary governance. A compromise. A mask, again, designed to impress the West while quietly anchoring control in tradition. Or consider Japan's railroads, an icon of industrial modernity. From the first stretch between Shimbashi and Yokohama, trains arrived bearing British locomotives. But by 1906, the Japanese were not just operating trains, they were building them, designing them, improving them. What began as imitation turned to innovation. The same could be said for shipyards, arsenals, factories. Copying was the scaffolding. Creation followed. Still, not all transformations were so tidy. The act of mirroring carries psychological weight. And for some, the mask became too heavy. In cities, young men dressed in Western coats but whispered poems in ancient dialects. Women wore corsets in the morning and chanted Buddhist sutras at night. There was confusion, not only of style, but of self. In the newspapers, critics began to ask if we dress like them, build like them, rule like them. What remains of us? And this question was not rhetorical. It was national, because to become a superpower was not just to possess strength. It was to possess coherence, identity, authority. The power to define oneself in a world that tried to define you first. And so, Japan walked a perilous path borrowing enough to survive, but not so much as to vanish. In 1873, a theater troupe performed Shakespeare's Hamlet, translated into Japanese, staged in Western dress. The prince wore a doublet. The stage was gas-lit. But when he spoke of ghosts and vengeance, the audience heard echoes of the tale of the hike, of Minamoto and Taira. It was not betrayal, it was fusion. This, then, is the truth of Meiji's mirror. Japan did not become the West. It reflected it back, distorted, sharpened, adapted. The mask was never meant to be permanent. It was a phase in metamorphosis. And behind it, quietly, the face of something unmistakably Japanese began to reemerge. And yet, perhaps the most profound mimicry was not in what Japan copied, but in what it learned to reflect. Back at the world, and inward toward itself. The Western gaze, so often assumed to be the one that defines, began to be repurposed. Japan stared into it long enough not to become what it saw, but to understand the mechanics of being seen. Diplomats posed in Western suits. Scholars debated in European cafes. The elite recited Rousseau and Voltaire by lantern light, even as their sandals still tapped the ancient rhythms of temple stones. To a visiting foreigner, it all seemed familiar, civilized, theatrics of parody. But beneath the surface, Japan had not surrendered. It had camouflaged. In these acts of replication, it planted seeds of sovereignty. This was not wholesale westernization. It was choreography. A nation rearranging itself not to please but to perform. Not to assimilate but to deflect invasion through performance. In 1885, statesmen at Harobumi stood before the German Reichstag and defended Japan's constitutional ambitions. Fluent in the logic of European law, dressed in impeccable Western tailoring, he delivered his words with surgical precision. To his hosts, he looked and sounded like one of them. But when he returned to Tokyo, he entered a Shinto shrine and offered quiet thanks. Not to Bismarck or Berlin, but to his ancestors. This duality, this strategic doubleness, became the Meiji way. And in that doubleness lay a subtle form of power. A strength not rooted in domination, but in cultural translation. Japan didn't merely adopt foreign models. It repurposed them. The school system, for example, mirrored Prussian hierarchy, but layered it with Confucian morality. Industrial capitalism flourished, but coexisted with village festivals and moon, viewing poetry. One foot in the coal furnace, the other in the tea garden. This was the Meiji Miracle at its most paradoxical, the creation of a modern state that never fully betrayed its ancient soul, even as it pretended to. But the cost of the performance was real. The mask protected, but it also weighed heavily. The constant awareness of being watched, by the West, by one another, by one's future self, created a kind of psychic tension that never fully relaxed. To be Japanese in the Meiji era was to be both actor and audience. To applaud the nation's forward march, even as one quietly mourned what was left behind in the footfalls. And still, it worked. Japan, through its mirror, play, earned the one thing it had always been denied by the West: recognition. Not charity, not pity. By 1900, it stood not as a student, but as a rival. Its ambassadors sat at imperial banquets. Its navy cast shadows across seas once ruled by others. Its rail lines and telegraphs connected what had once been isolated islands into a single humming organism. It had borrowed, yes. But it had also edited, retranslated, and reasserted. It had passed through the fire and returned with something new. Not wholly Western, not wholly ancient. Something Japanese. And in that hybrid form, forged through mimicry and defiance, came the shape of a nation that would astonish the world. Not because it looked Western, but because, at last, it no longer had to. At dawn, the mist over Tokyo rises not from temple incense but from the mouths of steam locomotives. Where once wooden homes with sliding doors hugged narrow, irregular alleys, now stood wide boulevards and brick facades. Lamps imported from Belgium lit the way for carriages with polished axles, and beneath those wheels, the memory of dirt paths and straw sandals lingered like a fading shadow. Japan's cities, especially Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, were being rewritten. Not only rebuilt, but reimagined. This was not merely a facelift, it was a statement. In the mirror of modernity, Japan was composing a new urban identity that could stand beside Paris, Berlin, New York. And at the center of this performance stood Tokyo, renamed from Edo, stripped of its feudal seams and redressed as an imperial capital. A city born again through borrowed blueprints, rising in concrete defiance of the centuries that had made it. To foreign observers, it looked like a miracle. But for those within, it felt like rupture. Because the city had a memory. Beneath the cobblestones now laid by imported engineers, there was still the soft footprint of kimono hems. Under the arches of gas-lit bridges, there remained the echo of the samurai's pace, and in the silence after dusk, after the wheels stopped turning and the gears cooled, one could almost hear the land remembering what it used to be. The transformation was total. French architects were invited to draw grids over a city that once bent to the whim of rivers and mountains. Parks were installed with European symmetry. Fireproof buildings replaced wooden tea-houses. Gutters ran in straight lines like veins. Even time became visible. Clock towers rose where no such precision had been needed before. Time was no longer seasonal, cyclical, spiritual. It ticked now, unyielding. But this was not an act of worship toward the West. It was a negotiation with survival. The Japanese state understood what the Western gaze demanded: geometry, symmetry, sanitation, legibility. Cities needed to look modern to be treated as modern. Diplomacy began at the edge of a paved street. Trade agreements were influenced by the shape of a skyline. The city became its own kind of ambassador, less a dwelling, more a declaration. Still, for every edifice raised, something was buried. Families who had lived in the same neighborhood for generations were relocated to make room for factories or widened roads. Shrines were displaced. The past was not erased violently, but it was shuffled, quietly, respectfully, into the margins. Progress, after all, did not announce its casualties. It simply reorganized them. And yet, the spirit did not vanish. In a Western-style hotel built near Hibiya Park, a bellhop folded his towel with the precision of a no-performer. The gaslight in the lobby flickered like a temple lantern. At a railway station, a porter recited train times with the cadence of Buddhist chant. Even amid iron and soot, there remained a softness, a residual presence, that whispered this land is older than these walls. Urbanization in Meiji Japan did not destroy tradition. It dislocated it, pushed it into corners, alleys, rooftops, memories. It survived in gestures, in habits, in the way an umbrella was carried, or a hand bowed even while dressed in a three-piece suit. One poet, witnessing Tokyo's transformation, wrote, "The city walks ahead of me now. I chase it like a child chasing a kite it no longer recognizes." This was the grief, but also the awe. For in this vast reconfiguration of space, this translation of Japan's soul into architecture and asphalt, there emerged a quiet empowerment. A belief that the past was not the only thing sacred, that the future, too, could be worthy of devotion, that a city could be both mirror and mask, reflecting the world's image, while concealing its own design beneath the surface. And so the Paris of the East was born. Not a copy, but a clever illusion. A costume sewn in stone and suit. A city that said, "We understand you," while secretly whispering, "You do not yet understand us." But what does it mean to live inside a city that is trying not just to grow, but to perform? For all its steel and symmetry, Meiji Tokyo was still a stage, and every building a prop. The city's rapid refashioning was less a matter of concrete and more a choreography of perception. When the West arrived, it looked for familiar cues. Avenues, factories, railroads. Japan responded not merely by accommodating those cues, but by anticipating them. The illusion of parity became the first layer of power, and like any illusion, it required precision. The brick-laid banks on Nihonbashi echoed those of London. The rooftops of the Diet building arched ever so slightly, just enough to preserve a native contour within a foreign silhouette. Even the uniforms of civil servants, tight, colored, double-breasted, whispered of Berlin's bureaucracy while walking the bones of Confucian order. Tokyo did not simply emulate. It translated, and sometimes mistranslated, with cunning purpose. But within the translation came tension. Elder artisans who once carved temple dragons were now asked to emboss imperial crests onto iron gates. A lacquer master, whose father had adorned shrines, now gilded mailboxes. This was not betrayal, it was displacement. A nation reassigning its genius, asking beauty to serve the machinery of order. Not everyone resisted, but few emerged unchanged. And then, there was the silence, the aching absence of what could not be rebuilt. The scent of tatami after a summer rain replaced by wet stone, the rhythm of clogs on wooden planks drowned by the clang of trams. Lantern light swallowed by the buzz of electric glow. It was not loss in the loud sense. It was erosion. The kind that comes slowly, respectfully, until one day the sound of your own language against a skyline no longer feels native. Still, the soul finds places to hide. In a neighborhood rebuilt with Western facades, a woman continued to sweep her storefront stoop in the exact circular motion her grandmother taught her. Children in sailor uniforms bowed before shrines on their way to chemistry class. A bureaucrat, fluent in French, stopped each morning at a small Shinto altar near the station. The cities were not merely rewritten, they were layered. The past survived, not in monuments, but in muscle memory. That is how masks work. They conceal, but they also protect. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, they wore the mask of Western civility, but beneath it pulsed a refusal to be erased. These cities did not surrender, they staged. They gestured. They negotiated their rebirth not as blank slates, but as palimpsests. And for those who knew how to look, the mask became not a lie, but a language of its own. Japan was not becoming Europe. It was becoming legible to Europe. Long enough to withstand it, long enough to transcend it. And in the dusk light over Marunouchi, when the glass towers held the last gold of day, one could see it clearly, not imitation, but metamorphosis. They did not smile often. When they did, it was calculated. An expression chosen with the same care as the calligraphy on a formal letter. The men who represented Meiji Japan on the world stage walked through banquet halls and treaty rooms, not as diplomats in the Western sense, but as living contradictions, emissaries of a civilization ancient beyond comprehension, now forced to dress itself in the language and lace of foreign empires. But this was no surrender. It was theater. Diplomacy, for Meiji Japan, became an art form of mimicry and subversion. The performance of parody, tailcoats, French phrases, cigars exchanged beneath chandeliers, was less about admiration and more about camouflage. These staged encounters allowed Japan to maneuver within a global order designed to exclude it. And in the shadows of those great halls, something subversive pulsed at the quiet refusal to bow, not physically. Consider the Iwakura Mission, 1871. A diplomatic caravan of scholars, nobles, and samurai turned statesmen embarking on a 600-day odyssey across America and Europe. On paper, a fact-finding expedition. In practice, a haunting revelation. They walked through factories that coughed smoke into the sky, parliaments with thunderous orators, museums filled with loot parading as enlightenment. Japan had opened its eyes, and what it saw was not gods, but machinery. Empires made of gears, guns, and contracts. And so, they returned not starstruck but steel-hearted. They had seen the mask of civilization and recognized it for what it was, a uniform worn to dominate. If Japan was to survive, it too would have to wear it. Not as flattery, but as armor. Ambassadors became actors. Every bow had a spine behind it. Every treaty signature, a quiet dagger removed from the heart of inferiority. Yet the cost was more than cultural. Dignity was bartered in inches. Unequal treaties, extraterritoriality, the humiliation of being treated as half sovereign in a world that respected only gunboats. The same hands that built the illusion of equality were forced to endure its constant unraveling. In such moments, a darker tension grew. How long could Japan perform civility when it was being denied justice? Thus, the mask began to harden. The theater of diplomacy, once fluid and performative, grew rigid. Bowing turned to silence. Hospitality became calculation. Japan would learn every rule of Western engagement, but beneath it brewed the awareness that true respect would not come from mimicry. It would come only when Japan became dangerous. This was not a thirst for conquest. It was survival through spectacle. At Versailles, in 1919, Japan arrived as one of the victors of World War I, seeking recognition as an equal, only to find its proposal for racial equality dismissed with casual disdain. The lesson was final and sharp: power respects only itself. And if Japan was to be heard, it would have to speak in a new tongue. Military, industrial, imperial. The diplomat's smile faded. The actor stepped offstage. Something colder took its place. And yet, within that coldness, there was still poise, still precision, still a desire, not to mimic the West, but to eclipse it without forgetting the centuries that came before. Even as Japan crafted battleships and broadcast signals, it sent haiku into space and folded memory into silence. In diplomacy, as in theater, dignity is often a rehearsal for revenge. But mimicry has limits, and masks, if worn long enough, alter the face beneath them. In every embassy banquet, every Western-style reception in Tokyo's new brick districts, Japan played its part with flawless choreography. But beneath the silverware clinks and polite laughter, there lay the residue of humiliation. For all its tailoring and etiquette, the Western powers still looked upon Japan not as a partner, but as an anomaly. Sophisticated, perhaps, but not equal. Not yet. This was a performance staged in rooms where treaties spoke louder than history, where protocol became its own weapon. Japan, ancient and unyielding, had stepped onto the world stage, only to find it built upon sand, where the rules shifted at the whims of empire. And yet it adapted. A young Japanese diplomat in London once wrote in his journal, "To be heard here, one must first speak in silence." He wasn't describing language. He was speaking of posture. Japan's early diplomacy wasn't about talking. It was about not reacting, not flinching when mocked, not withdrawing when dismissed. There was power in stillness, in being misread and underestimated. Patience was political, but patience did not mean passivity. Back home, the theater of diplomacy became a stage for something deeper: the construction of a narrative. The modernization of Japan's legal system, its adoption of Western jurisprudence and civil codes, its relentless petitioning to revise the unequal treaties. These were not administrative reforms. They were acts of defiance written in the language of legitimacy. Japan was not asking for equality. It was daring the world to deny it. Consider the case of Minister Matsu Munimitsu. After years of studied politeness and diplomatic ice, Matsu negotiated the revision of the Treaty of Kanagawa with Britain in 1894. It was a quiet triumph, but its meaning was volcanic. For the first time since Commodore Perry's black ships had darkened Edo Bay, Japan was no longer subject to extraterritorial law. It could prosecute a British subject on its own soil. The empire had spoken, softly, in parchment and ink, and yet the world heard steel. Still, victories like this did not erase the sting of earlier decades. There was grief woven into Japan's diplomatic rise. The grief of concessions made under threat, of sovereign rituals replaced with parliamentary mimicry, of imperial pride disguised behind imported manners. This was not just the construction of modern statehood. It was the burial of an older dignity. And so, diplomacy became ritual, but with a new kind of sacredness. Not the divinity of the Chrysanthemum throne, but the secular sanctity of survival. Japan had learned to speak with the poise of Europe, but beneath that accent, there lingered the rhythms of a warrior tradition reshaped, not erased. In time, the suits would become uniforms, the pens would give way to arsenals, and the soft voices in foreign ministries would echo into chambers of war. But in this moment, this exact moment, Japan stood at the threshold between theater and throne. Dignity was no longer inherited. It was claimed. At first, they borrowed because they had to. Uniforms, parliaments, factories, even haircuts. Western blueprints were poured like molten steel into the mold of a wounded empire. The Meiji state mimicked, mimed, copied, not out of awe, but out of sheer, strategic necessity. It was a masquerade performed with ferocious intent. But all masks eventually melt, or fuse with the face. What happens when imitation becomes transformation? This is the quiet pivot few noticed as it was happening. Japan, no longer content to copy, began to create. Not in rejection of what had been learned, but in an act of cultural alchemy. The foreign suit was no longer just a costume. It became part of the national skin. The rifle was not just a Western weapon. It was held with a samurai's spine. A country that had once asked, how do we look like them? Had begun to ask, instead, how do we look like ourselves? Again. In this strange interstice between East and West, tradition and rupture, something unprecedented took shape, a modernity that was not a mirror but a mosaic. Consider the 1889 Meiji Constitution. Written with Prussian ink, yes, but framed within a Shinto cosmology. The emperor, a divine figure cloaked in modern sovereignty, was both the sun and the state. The contradiction was the design. Japan didn't solve the tension between old and new. It weaponized it. Or take the imperial rescript on education, declared in 1890, recited by millions of schoolchildren for decades. Its language, poetic and severe, instructed youth to be loyal, moral, sacrificial. But beneath its Confucian cadence lay a modern pedagogical engine: mass literacy, uniform behavior, centralized thought. A warrior ethic rebottled in ink. The kodo still played in parlors, but it now accompanied a piano. Tea ceremonies survived, but they were sometimes served in homes with gaslight, beside shelves of Dickens and Darwin. Tokyo, once Edo, still smelled of tatami and smoke, but now echoed with telegraph clicks, locomotive bells, the laughter of girls in sailor collar school uniforms. Identity was not being erased. It was being reforged, hammered on the anvil of contradiction. And through this, a new self-image emerged, not Western, not feudal, not hybrid, something else, something untranslatable. The painter Kuroda Seiki, trained in Paris, returned to Japan and began to craft oil portraits of kimono-clad women, rendered not as exotic subjects but as sovereign presences. He did not simply bring back a technique. He brought back a way of seeing, and then turned it inward. That gaze, that double vision, became emblematic of the Meiji soul, one eye scanning the West, the other fixed on the ancestral grave. But such vision came at a cost. To carry two cultural codes at once, to straddle centuries in a single lifetime, was not a seamless feat. For every triumph of reinvention, there were inner exiles, elders who could no longer recognize the speech of their grandchildren, samurai who wandered Tokyo's wide boulevards in stiff European coats, eyes vacant with lost purpose. The transformation was not merely institutional. It was metaphysical. The Japanese spirit was not diluted. It was pressurized. A diamond formed not through clarity, but compression. In the end, the Meiji Miracle was not the triumph of one model over another. It was the forging of a blade with two edges, one curved in memory, the other straight with ambition. Japan had not shed its past. It had learned how to wear it as armor. But beneath every adaptation lies a question more searing than strategy. Who are we becoming when we change to survive? By the 1890s, Japan had become a kaleidoscope of contradictions. Silk-robed courtiers drafted telegraph codes. Generals wore Prussian epaulettes yet bowed before shrines. The foreign and the native no longer lived side by side. They had fused in tension, in harmony, in necessary distortion. Identity was not recovered. It was engineered. This was not mimicry. This was synthesis under duress. Not capitulation but recalibration. Japan was no longer looking to the West merely for templates. It was harvesting fragments, military drills, constitutional law, architectural geometry, and welding them onto a samurai soul already cracked by the fires of internal revolution. Consider the kanji used to translate nation-state. Kakugoda. The term itself was a linguistic act of transformation. a Western political abstraction, naturalized into the bones of a language whose glyphs once knew only clan, emperor, and cosmos. The modern nation had to be invented, and then made to feel ancient. And it wasn't just ideas that were reforged. It was bodies. The soldier, the bureaucrat, the schoolgirl, all became state-constructed symbols. Uniforms stitched conformity into the skin. From conscription to compulsory education, the individual was slowly rewritten into a node of the nation. And in this rewriting, the imperial center, the emperor, was elevated to something new, not just sovereign, not just symbol, but synthesis incarnate. He embodied the fusion, the fiction, the hope. But fiction has gravity. The longer it is performed, the more real it becomes. And Japan, by 1900, had grown into its mask, no longer a shadow of the West, but a new silhouette altogether. We see this in the arts, too. In the Nen theater, directors began experimenting with electric light and painted realism. In literature, Natsume S. Seiki wrote novels where introspection and alienation became central themes. Echoes of the Western psychological novel, but refracted through the lens of Japanese loneliness. These were not acts of copying, they were acts of reinterpretation. Cultural judo. Perhaps nothing captures this better than the architecture of Tokyo's Ginza district. Here, Western-style brick buildings rose where wooden merchant shops once stood. But these were not pure transplants. They were hybrids, blending Victorian geometry with Edo sensibility. Streets widened not just to accommodate carriages, but to signal a civilization accelerating. Facades changed. So did the weather of the soul. Still, the wounds were real. Farmers conscripted into the machinery of modern finance wept as they lost ancestral land. Artisans watched their crafts vanish into factory automation. Elder monks, surrounded by iron railways and glass banks, whispered sutras into air now filled with steam and sirens. And yet, from this grief, dignified, wordless, enduring, came a strange and solemn power, to change while remembering, to modernize without erasing, to burn the scroll, but memorize the lines. In forging this new identity, Japan proved something that still echoes today, that civilization does not always evolve by choosing between tradition and modernity. Sometimes it survives by refusing the binary entirely. It becomes both. And the mask, it does not come off, it becomes the face. The sound that remade Japan was not cannon fire, nor the shriek of a steam whistle. It was the brittle, measured clang of a school bell. And for many, it rang not as promise, but as farewell. In village after village, children once destined to inherit rice fields or temples now marched beneath the banners of modernity. The Meiji government, in its ruthless brilliance, understood that true transformation required more than treaties or factories. It needed minds. It needed time itself to be remapped inside the skulls of the young, and so they built schools. Not as sanctuaries of inquiry, but as engines of assimilation. Uniforms replaced kimono. The imperial rescript on education was drilled like scripture. History was cleansed and re-scripted not to remember, but to unify. Confucian obedience and Western discipline fused into a new architecture of loyalty. A child was no longer simply a son or daughter. They were now seedlings of the kokutai, the national body. Yet beneath this vast machinery of enlightenment, something softer cracked. In a small town outside Okayama, a mother watched her daughter recite German phrases she could not understand. The girl's handwriting was perfect, her bow immaculate, and yet the lullabies of old were gone from her lips. At night, the mother sang them alone to the silence. These are not stories recorded in textbooks. They echo instead in the absences, in the rooms where Buddhist altars were replaced by portraits of the emperor, where calligraphy gave way to chemistry, and the rhythms of village life collapsed under the weight of standardized time. This was the cost of modernization not written in ledgers, the funeral drum that followed the school bell. In the rush to forge a modern state, Japan did not just build infrastructure. It demolished ecosystems of memory. The shrine elder whose tongue faltered trying to read modern newspapers. The weaver whose loom was silenced by the hiss of imported thread. The patriarch whose authority dissolved the day his son saluted an army officer instead of him. And yet, there was wonder too. To a girl in Kyoto, once forbidden from scholarly dreams, the new education offered strange wings. She read Rousseau by lantern light. She dreamt of politics, of Tokyo, of a voice. In the ruins of the old, seeds of agency stirred. Not everyone mourned. Some emerged. This duality, the gift wrapped in grief, is the defining texture of the Meiji Miracle. For every door opened, another was brick shut. For every library built, a lineage forgotten. And through it all, the drums continued in classrooms, on battlefields, in factory floors where children's hands shaped the steel of a rising empire. The sacred and the disposable blurred. In this crucible, Japan became not just stronger, but stranger to itself. The nation was no longer a collection of villages. It was a doctrine, an idea, a myth rehearsed each morning in schoolyards and saluted in silence. Was it worth it? That is not a question history answers. But it is one we must carry, like incense, like memory, like the lingering scent of a childhood that belonged to no one and everyone. The school bell still rings, but if you listen closely, the funeral drum echoes underneath. But not all sacrifices were silent. In the northeast, a boy named Haruki disappeared into the dark corridors of a textile mill at the age of 10, not because he was orphaned or cast aside, but because his country needed fabric, uniforms, threads of empire. His fingers bled before they learned how to work the imported looms. His breath shortened before he learned to keep time with the machines. He never saw a classroom. But every meter of cloth he helped produce clothed someone else's future. His name does not appear in any reform decree, yet he was a pillar of it, and so it was across the archipelago. Grandfathers who once led harvest songs now stared into empty courtyards, their stories spoken into wind. Daughters became factory hands, their dowries traded for factory wages. Priests taught arithmetic, monks learned state law. The fabric of social inheritance unraveled, not torn, but pulled thread by thread, until the garments of identity hung unrecognizably on unfamiliar shoulders. Even the language of time changed. Hours became regulated. Seasons became fiscal quarters. What had once been marked by solstice and shrine was now tracked by railway schedules and ministry mandates. Childhood, too, shrank into something measured by school years, standardized tests, draft age. Yet within this whirlwind, beneath the steel bones of modernity, flickered strange intimacies. A father, once a swordsman, now showing his son how to write a Roman alphabet. A grandmother slipping old proverbs into westernized lullabies. These were quiet rebellions, acts of love insisting that beneath the reforms and slogans, there still lived a lineage, a breath, a whisper from before. But these were exceptions, not rules, and the Meiji state had little patience for nostalgia. Obedience was not optional. The curriculum was a ritual of forgetting, designed not to illuminate, but to overwrite. It was not about the multiplication table. It was about singular vision, one emperor, one nation, one destiny. Still, the cost lingered, not in ledger books, but in hearts. At the funeral of a samurai teacher who had spent his final years instructing chemistry in a school built atop his family's ancestral land, a student bowed deeply. He whispered, "Sensei taught us how to see atoms, but he never forgot how to see spirits." In that contradiction, Japan breathed. For the miracle of Meiji was not a miracle at all. It was a bargain, a brutal, brilliant gamble. The school bell did not simply summon students. It rang across generations, tolling a price. That in becoming new, they would carry the ghosts of what was lost. That in surviving, they would ache. And yet, out of that ache, something enduring was born. Not just a superpower, but a strange, singular form of modernity, neither mimicry nor rejection, but a tapestry stitched with steam and memory, lacquer and light. This was the Japan the world would come to see. Not simply risen, but reforged. And yet, even as bells rang and curricula marched forward, not all could keep pace. There were villages where the old ways curled like smoke from dying hearths, where the elderly told stories not to preserve them, but to keep themselves from vanishing entirely, where a mother would lace her daughter's hair in silence before sending her off to a boarding school that spoke only in tongues foreign to their house, where Buddhist sutras were chanted over the graves of children who'd collapsed in textile factories, honored not as martyrs, but quietly buried as casualties of national ambition. In those places, the funeral drum beat faintly against the clang of blackboards and assembly lines. One rhythm mourned, the other marched. And between them, a generation stood straddling two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The nation was modernizing, yes, but it was also forgetting, or rather, being made to forget. There is a photograph, rare, barely remembered, of a group of schoolboys standing stiffly in woolen uniforms outside a red, brick schoolhouse. One boy's hakama peeks out beneath the hem, a quiet rebellion stitched into fabric. His eyes meet the lens not with pride, but with something older, something hollow. He would become a civil servant. He would never again speak the dialect of his grandmother. He would name his son after a statesman, not a poet. This was the unseen arithmetic of transformation. Every new rail, every spinning wheel, every line of policy written in Tokyo had a hidden denominator. Something or someone subtracted, and the tally of loss was rarely spoken aloud. But it is there. In the tired eyes of teachers forced to teach creeds they barely believed. In the creaking knees of blacksmiths, retrained to fit pipes instead of blades. In lullabies that lost their meanings even as their melodies endured. These were the wounds that did not bleed. They festered in silences, in awkward meals, in shrines left untended because their keepers had taken factory jobs. Yet not all was erasure. What emerged through this crucible was something rare, a nation that did not merely mimic the West, but devoured it, metabolized it, and spit it back out wrapped in the aesthetics of precision and restraint. A society that kept the cadence of old rituals even within concrete walls. A people who could wield calculus and ceremony in the same hand. The school bell and the funeral drum, one calling forward, the other echoing behind, would never truly harmonize. But Japan did not wait for harmony. It moved forward with both sounds in its ears, fractured yet resolute, haunted yet whole. They did not fall in battle. They were not undone by foreign invasion, nor dragged from their posts in some grand reckoning. The samurai, those ink-stained blades of Bushido, died quieter deaths. Deaths of paper, of decree, of being asked to become something else. In 1876, the Hate-Ria Edict struck like lightning in reverse, not to illuminate, but to silence. The carrying of swords in public, once a birthright of honor, the katana, once the soul of a man, became contraband in the new corridors of power. Not shattered, but shelved. Not outlawed, but outlived. And so, the warrior found himself staring not down an enemy's spear, but at a future that no longer needed him. In homes that still smelled of incense and oil, fathers unstrapped their dash for the last time. Children watched their heroes dress in Western frock coats and disappear into bureaucratic obscurity. There was no final duel, no glorious seppuku to mark the end of centuries. Just ledgers, just pension withdrawals and rail timetables. Some resisted. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 was not a revolution, it was a requiem. Seige Takamori, once a pillar of Meiji reform, took up his sword against the very machine he helped build. His rebellion was crushed in months, but it left something enduring, the archetype of tragic resistance. A man too noble to bend, too proud to survive. The samurai had not failed, they had become obsolete. And what is more brutal than being made unnecessary? For centuries, they were not just a class. They were a code, a mirror held up to the nation's sense of self. Now, they were clerks, translators, teachers of a curriculum that no longer traced lineage to Confucius or the Book of Five Rings, but to Newton and Bentham. Their sons grew up reciting English verbs instead of battle cries. Their daughters no longer practiced calligraphy with brush and scroll, but were taught household management in classrooms styled after Prussian models. One might think the sword was traded for the pen, but in truth, it was traded for silence. A silence that coated dinner tables where old men no longer spoke of campaigns, only accounts payable. Where armor collected dust in storerooms behind framed photographs of young men in military uniforms that bore no crest, no family emblem, no whisper of tradition. In a small town near Kanazawa, an aging samurai carved wooden toys to sell at market. His customers were children who had never seen a duel. His hands, once calloused from grip and discipline, now made spinning tops and wind chimes. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "So that I still remember how to shape something." The tragedy of the samurai was not that they were defeated, but that they were folded into a future that did not ask for their permission. Their fall was not a collapse but a diffusion into the architecture of the new Japan. Their spirit, their rigor, their poise, these were not lost but sublimated into factories, into formality and craft and codes of conduct so precise they could pass for ritual. And yet, in moments of great ceremony or crisis, even now, a certain stillness returns, a posture, a silence before motion, an elegance not taught but remembered. The ghost of the blade remains, not in hand, but in spine, for modern Japan was not built on the ashes of its warriors, but with their bones beneath the foundation, their pride transmuted, their sorrow silent, their sacrifice unacknowledged, yet indivisible from the strength of what came after. But even without their swords, the samurai did not vanish. They endured in fragments, like broken porcelain reassembled with gold, not to hide the cracks, but to honor them. Some became bureaucrats, navigating new hierarchies with the same discipline they once used on the battlefield. Others opened schools, shaping boys into men not with weaponry, but with ethics, math, and Meiji ideology. Their code of Bushido did not dissolve, it diluted into the bloodstream of modern Japan, less visible, more pervasive. The rigidity of formality, the ferocity beneath restraint, the reverence for order and ritual, these were not foreign implants, but echoes of a class disarmed but not dismembered. Still, the dissonance lingered. A father who once carried his lineage on his blade now carried it on government stamps and civil registries. Identity once forged in iron was now penciled into forms. His son might wear a Western uniform and learn foreign scripts, but his grandfather's armor remained in the attic, heavy and untouched. Less a relic than a burden, too sacred to display, too painful to discard. In Hiroshima, a letter from 1883 survives, written by a former samurai turned mail clerk. He writes to a cousin in Tottori, "When I walk past the training hall, I feel as if my feet remember how to move even though my hands forget how to grip. The blade is gone, but the stance remains. I bow to no one now, but still I bow." There is no anger in his words, only ache. This was the quiet grief of the Meiji Restoration. Transformation not by war, but by withdrawal. A generational suicide conducted without blood, only ink. It was not the West that killed the samurai. It was modernity itself, unyielding and impersonal, consuming all in its forward march. Not out of hatred, but necessity. Yet beneath this mourning lies something profound, a nation's refusal to discard its soul, even as it amputated parts of its body. The samurai were not erased, they were sublimated. Their values were not lost, they were reinterpreted, sometimes forcibly, sometimes subtly, into the machinery of modern life. In the architecture of new government ministries, in the precision of train schedules, in the quiet grace of tea poured by hands trained to strike. There the spirit of the samurai lingered, transformed, translated, tempered. This was not defeat. It was metamorphosis. Japan did not survive because it mimicked the West. It survived because it endured the death of one of its most sacred pillars, and turned that death into scaffolding for rebirth. The sword was not only beaten into plowshares, it was also melted down and reforged into typewriters, microscopes, and printing presses. And that is perhaps the greatest irony. The men who once defined themselves by the ability to take life now laid the foundation for a nation determined to preserve it. Through innovation, education, and relentless adaptation. The warrior became the teacher, the enforcer became the engineer, the ghost became the blueprint. The soul remained. The revolutions that tear down monuments are always visible. The ones that build the future in silence, those are harder to see, but they leave deeper scars. While the world watched samurai fall and steam engines rise, another transformation churned beneath the surface, unheralded, unsung, but no less ferocious. It unfolded not in courtrooms or battlefields, but in silk mills, schoolyards, kitchens, and delivery rooms. It was waged by women, millions of them, whose labor stitched the Meiji Miracle together thread by thread, breath by breath, child by child. They were the weavers of the new Japan. When the government turned its eyes to industrialization, it found its most willing and cheapest workers in young rural girls. Often no older than 12 or 13, they were sent, or sold, by their families to textile factories, especially silk reeling plants, where they worked 14-hour shifts in suffocating heat. Fingers blistered, lungs scarred, backs bent permanently forward, they spun the raw dreams of a modern economy from cocoons, feeding the empire's hunger for foreign currency and international prestige. The nation called it progress. But for them, it was sacrifice in slow motion. Yuki, a girl from Nagano, wrote in a faded diary, "I want to be the thread that makes Japan strong. If I suffer, maybe father can keep the land. Maybe my brother can go to school. Maybe my sisters will not have to come here after me." Her handwriting trembles not from fear, but from fatigue. These were not victims. They were pillars paid in silence and skin. And at home, the transformation ran just as deep. As men became bureaucrats, soldiers, and engineers, the role of the wife and mother mutated. She was expected to preserve the rituals of the old world while raising children ready to serve the new one. She boiled rice and ironed uniforms. She folded kimonos with one hand and textbooks with the other. Her role was devotional, but also infrastructural. Without her, the gears of the new order would seize. She did not vote. She did not legislate. But she governed the soul of the household, the first school of nationalism, the earliest altar of duty. This was not empowerment in the modern, emancipatory sense. It was sacrifice as architecture. Women were asked to carry forward tradition and erase it at once, to teach obedience and adaptability, to praise honor and endure dishonor. Their power was quiet, but it was absolute. In 1903, the government published a morality manual for schoolgirls. It read, "A good woman is one who does not think of herself." But what it failed to say, and what history rarely admits, is that without women who did, the Meiji state would have collapsed under its own velocity. The men who built railroads and drafted constitutions were born of wombs that bore contradictions more profound than any treaty. And those contradictions were generational. Mothers of iron gave birth to daughters of fire. By 1910, female literacy had more than doubled from the start of the Meiji Era. Girls read newspapers. They attended teacher training colleges. They started to write. Not just letters home, but essays, poems, and novels. The very daughters of factory girls began to shape language itself. Transformation was no longer something done to them. It became something they could imagine, then claim. Still, Many of them died unknown. Some were buried beneath the same soil they helped save. Others vanished into marriage, into war, into anonymity. But their fingerprints remain. In the syntax of reform, in the cadence of resilience, in the bones of a nation that still reveres harmony but was built, ultimately, on fracture. If the samurai were the soul of old Japan, then these women were the marrow of the new. They bled for it, broke for it, bore it. And though their names seldom make it into textbooks, their legacy lives on in every breath of modernity Japan exhales. They moved through the world unseen, but not unfelt. Their names rarely entered newspapers or policy debates. Yet their fingerprints were etched into every reform, every steel beam, every line of law and line of life that emerged from Japan's convulsive rebirth. The Meiji state built itself on modern maps and measured time, but it was women who kept the unseen ledger paying in silence, in labor, and in lives for a vision they had little voice in shaping, but without which it would have remained only a dream. These were the mothers of iron, not because they forged weapons, but because they absorbed the nation's fracture and reformed it into endurance. In newly established girls' schools, discipline arrived in the form of Western uniforms, rote drills, and imperial hymns. But behind the stern rhythm of militarized education was another current, quieter, deeper. Mothers, now both tradition bearers and reform brokers, had to learn the choreography of a world where their daughters were expected to bow to the emperor and conjugate French verbs before they understood what they meant to lose. The home became a crucible where the old and the imported collided nightly at the dinner table. And yet, they adapted. A seamstress named Kana worked 12-hour shifts at a Yokohama uniform factory, then came home to teach her 2 sons how to write with ink sticks. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion alone, but from the weight of dual loyalties to her ancestors, who taught her that silence was virtue, and to her children, who would need a louder kind of courage to thrive in the new century. Her sacrifice was never inscribed on national monuments. But every child she raised became a monument in motion. In spinning mills and teacher colleges, women began to recognize their own potential not only as supporters of the state, but as thinkers, critics, and quiet insurgents. The Meiji elite tolerated women's literacy for its utility. Better mothers made better imperial subjects. But words, once learned, cannot be unlearned. Language was a virus, and within it lived subversion. By the 1890s, female poets like Higuchi Ichi were weaving melancholy and revolt into classical forms, daring to depict lives the state preferred to render invisible. Their voices didn't shout, they ached, and in that ache lived a new kind of authorship, not just of literature, but of identity. Still, even these awakenings came at a cost. The pursuit of modern womanhood fractured families along generational lines. Daughters rejected arranged marriages. Mothers watched traditions dissolve through the keyholes of progress. And all the while, the state praised their patriotic motherhood with the left hand and tightened their legal silence with the right. They were celebrated, but not heard, honored, but not free. Yet in the rupture, they planted seeds, not of rebellion, necessarily, but of reinterpretation. A daughter who watched her mother stitch national pride into a school bag also learned how to undo a seam. A wife who boiled rice for a bureaucrat also read translated novels late into the night, her mind reshaping the parameters of fate. The revolution of women during the Meiji Era was not one of marches, but of migrations, out of prescribed roles into liminal space. Their names did not fill the headlines, but they filled the homes, the classrooms, the waiting rooms, the memories, and slowly they filled the future. If Japan became steel, it was these women who tempered it. If it moved forward, it was because they held steady. If it endured, it is because they refused to disappear, even when history tried to forget them. The sun did not rise faster, but time did. In Meiji Japan, destiny picked up its pace, shedding centuries like old skin. One generation could be born into feudal rice paddies and die surrounded by smokestacks and telegram wires. The transformation was not slow, not evolutionary. It was convulsive. It tore, it dazzled, it overwhelmed, and always it accelerated. From a distance, it looked like progress. A nation sprinting forward, catching up to the empires that once called it backward. But within, there was whiplash. Villages became cities before their names changed on the maps. Sons became engineers before their fathers learned to spell their own names in kana. History was no longer a patient river. It became a flood. The samurai, who once lived by the steady cadence of ritual and sword, now faced the silent tyranny of the mechanical clock. Time was no longer marked by temple bells, but by shift whistles and school bells. The calendar had been West militarized. The seasons corporatized. Progress demanded punctuality, and punctuality demanded submission to a new rhythm of reality. Imagine an old man in Kyoto in 1871 who had never seen a train. By 1899, that same man could take one to Tokyo and back, sit beside a banker in a top hat, pass a girl carrying a German textbook, and listen to the shouts of factory workers spilling into the street after an 18-hour shift. To survive was to adapt, and to adapt was to unlearn. In the space of 5 decades, Japan moved from plows to pistons, from clan loyalty to conscription, from calligraphy to carbon copy, and with each step forward, something irretrievable was left behind, not always mourned, but always felt. The sensation of time itself changed. A village elder once told stories to mark the passage of years. Now, posters did, newsprint did, government decrees did. Memory was no longer inherited through firelight, it was handed down through textbooks, standardized and sanctioned. Where once a grandfather taught his grandson to tie a hakama, now a teacher corrected the boy's French accent in a schoolroom patterned after Prussian ideals. Continuity, once sacred, had become negotiable. The Meiji Miracle was not only an economic feat, it was an existential gamble. Could a nation tear through time without breaking? Could it leap across centuries and still know its own name when it landed? Some tried to answer with flags and anthems, with constitution and code. Others answered with poetry. The world is fast, but my heart is slow, wrote a young woman in Osaka, watching telephone wires slice across a sky she no longer recognized. The speed of the nation was glorious, yes, but it was also disorienting. Some ran with it. Others stood still and let it pass through them like wind through tall grass. And yet, within this vertigo, something extraordinary took root. Children born into factories dreamed not of rice fields, but of electric light. Their frame of reference wasn't Confucian duty. It was industrial future. The past, for them, was not sacred. It was a challenge. This was the price and the prize of accelerated destiny. Dislocation in exchange for imagination. Memory traded for ambition. Of course, there were casualties. Not just of war or disease, but of time itself. There are losses no census can capture, the songs forgotten, the dialects erased, the rituals abandoned not by force but by fatigue. In a country where 500 years once felt like a single season, 50 now roared like a century. But the miracle was not that Japan survived the velocity. The miracle was that, somehow, it steered it. Not always cleanly, not always gently. But it did not crash, it reemerged fiercer, wiser, more fragmented, more whole. This was not evolution, it was combustion. And from its ashes rose something new, not Western, not ancient, not wholly knowable. Something forged in the alchemy of memory and machinery. Something still reaching forward. Quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. But in the slipstream of acceleration, even memory struggled to keep pace. Old families who once traced their lineage across 1,000 years now clutched certificates of graduation and land deeds as if they were talismans of permanence. A grandfather's armor, handed down with trembling reverence, was packed away in favor of imported suits and government pensions. The past did not vanish. It throbbed beneath the surface, distant, dissonant, uninvited, but never entirely silenced. In one Tokyo classroom in 1896, a young boy stood to recite a German phrase before a chalkboard etched with Western dates and foreign alphabets. His mother had taught him poetry by candlelight. Now he copied railroad timetables by gas lamp. He did not know he was living inside a rupture. He only knew the world had changed its face again, and he would have to learn to mirror it. Such was the cost of velocity, dislocation wrapped in advancement, bewilderment beneath innovation. The calendar pages turned faster, but not every heart beat in sync with the state's tempo. In rural prefectures, elders resisted rail lines that bisected sacred land. In port cities, children mimicked English accents they barely understood. In silence, a country counted the cost of its own ignition. And yet there was awe, not the awe of conquest or pageantry, but of witnessing the improbable. Japan was not merely keeping up with the West. It was outpacing itself, redefining its identity faster than any external observer could pin it down. The Western gaze was still there, still measuring, still doubting. But increasingly, it stared back in disbelief. They are not becoming us. One French envoy whispered in 1902. They are becoming something else entirely. Factories were built with European machines, but manned by hands that folded paper cranes with ancestral delicacy. Naval officers studied British tactics while carrying Shinto amulets under their uniforms. A geisha wore imported perfume beneath a kimono dyed with ancient indigo. Nothing was purely borrowed. Everything was bent, reformed, subsumed, until imitation gave way to invention. That, perhaps, was the real miracle, not the mimicry, but the metamorphosis. Modernity had arrived not as a clean slate, but as a battlefield of symbols, where tradition bled into technology and the future was negotiated, not inherited. The nation was not replacing itself. It was refracting, fracturing, multiplying. Like a mirror shattered and rearranged into stained glass, something beautiful emerged from the violence of transformation. But glass cuts, and speed wounds. Time compressed so ruthlessly did not allow for gentle reflection. It forced choices: build the ship or be drowned by it, write the law or be subject to one written in another tongue. Dignity was no longer ceremonial. It had to be engineered, armed, institutionalized. The nation's soul was not discarded. It was forged, reforged, and sharpened like steel. And those who survived this acceleration were not simply citizens. They were witnesses. Vessels of a story that even now eludes easy telling. Their grief, quiet. Their triumph, unspoken. Their lives, compressed into the folds of a timeline that would astonish every generation after them. Because in the end, Japan's race through history was not about catching up. It was about carving a space where the past and future could coexist. Not in harmony, but in tension. Not peacefully, but truthfully. A place where the blade and the book, the bell and the gun, the tea ceremony and the steam engine, all found uneasy company. And somehow that was enough to survive. In February 1904, under the shadowed silence of night, Japanese torpedo boats cut across the freezing waters of Port Arthur. No formal declaration, no grand speeches. Just a single ruthless decision, surgical, calculated, irrevocable. When the shells began to fall, it was not just a Russian fleet that would fracture. It was the world's sense of who held the right to shape destiny. For centuries, the global stage had been choreographed by Western empires. Japan had been cast as an audience, permitted to watch, expected to mimic. But now, in this clash with a European giant, it chose to rewrite the script. The Russo-Japanese War was more than a regional dispute. It was a metaphysical shockwave, proof that the East could not only modernize, it could strike. And the world flinched. The war unfurled with a cold, precise fury. Japan's generals wielded Prussian discipline, but marched with a bushied resolve that the West failed to interpret. Its battleships bore British blueprints, yet its motives pulsed with something older, ancestral and unsurrendered. Every maneuver was a paradox, modern tactics animated by ancient spirit. When victory came at Tsushima in 1905, it was not merely strategic, it was seismic. Imagine it: over 30 Russian ships decimated in a single day, the Imperial Russian Navy humiliated on an ocean they had assumed tame. Telegraphs snapped across Europe, disbelief trailing every dot and dash. Kipling called it uncanny. Roosevelt blinked and recalibrated. Colonized nations, India, Egypt, Vietnam, held their breath, then exhaled in defiance. An Asian nation had defeated a Western empire on open sea. The unthinkable had happened. But back home in the lantern-lit silence of ancestral halls, there was no triumphal cry, only breath held, and a question that would echo long after the medals had dulled: what had been won, and what had been traded away to win it. The Japanese people bore the weight not just of battle, but of becoming. The war was costly, economically, spiritually, biologically. Sons who once trained in kendo now fell to machine gun fire. Whole villages emptied into uniforms. Ritual and rhythm gave way to mobilization. Japan had proven its strength, but in doing so, it had stepped fully into the vortex of modern empire. Its future would no longer be its own to measure in cherry blossoms and moonlit verses. It now ticked in the tempo of coal, steel, and geopolitics. The Russo-Japanese War was not just the defeat of an enemy, it was the disintegration of a mask. Japan had pretended to be the student. Now it stood revealed as an actor capable of power, coercion, and conquest. But at what cost? The sword had become industrial. The warrior, bureaucratic. The island nation had claimed a place at the world's table, and would never again be allowed to sit quietly in the corner. In the wake of victory, Japan inherited more than land. It inherited expectation. The world now saw it not as curiosity, but as rival. The line between modern nation and imperial predator began to blur. Was this rebirth or reincarnation? And so, the echo of Tsushima would not fade. It reverberated through policies, philosophies, alliances. Through the hearts of schoolchildren taught to salute both emperor and empire. Through the tears of mothers who realized their sons were no longer meant to die with honor, but to die on schedule. History did not pause to reflect. It accelerated again. The war that shocked the world became a prophecy disguised as a headline. It said Japan has arrived. But hidden within that arrival was a rupture between what it had been and what it must now become. And there was no going back. Across Asia, the air shimmered differently after 1905. Not with the residue of gunpowder, but with the sudden, almost supernatural, awareness that the world's laws could be rewritten. That power, long held in the clenched fists of empire, had slipped, if only momentarily, into the hands of those once expected to kneel. In Manila, Rangoon, Delhi, whispers turned into manifestos. If Japan could rise, then what were the limits of ambition or rebellion? But while the world watched Japan with awe or suspicion, internally, the celebration was far more muted. Victory had come not from divine winds, but from meticulous imitation of battleship design, railway logistics, war finance, and diplomatic cunning. Japan had played a Western game and won. Yet in doing so, it had carved deep furrows across its own soil. What is the cost of proving oneself human in a world that presumed you less? The answer was not philosophical. It was visceral. Hospitals overflowed, taxes surged, rice bowls emptied, and beneath the polished images of triumphant generals, a nation trembled from the strain. The very modernization that had made victory possible had also made human life calculable, expendable, yet another tool of statecraft. There's a photo, sepia-toned, almost forgotten, of a child standing alone on a Tokyo street as the victory parade passes. The soldiers in their stiff uniforms march to Western drums, bayonets gleaming under borrowed military doctrine. The child, barefoot, clutches a wooden sword and watches. Not cheering, just watching. What stories was that child told? That Japan had proven its worth, that destiny had been earned, or that to live in a modern nation now meant surrendering your grandparents' rituals to clocks, drills, and foreign treaties. This war was not just about geopolitics, it was about time. Japan did not merely win territory, it accelerated itself. The war compressed centuries of humiliation, adaptation, and defiance into a single, staggering moment of global reckoning. It was not a climax, it was ignition. And once lit, that fire would demand more fuel, more resources, more conquests, more sacrifices dressed in the garments of national honor. The echoes of Tsushima were not confined to history books. They bled forward, into Manchuria, into Korea, into classrooms and family altars and factories. They transformed Japan's role from admired exception to restless contender. A precedent had been set: when Japan acts, the world reacts. And once you taste that kind of power, clean, public, intoxicating, how do you step back into silence? Yet for all its velocity, Japan still carried a heavy weight, the unresolved grief of having to become something else in order to survive. Every victory tattooed over a scar, every new ship christened in the name of a forgotten village. The future loomed, not with serenity, but with sharp angles and tightening timelines. This was the paradoxy. To be feared was to be respected. But to be respected, Japan had to unmake parts of itself. And in that tension, between the warrior's vow and the machinist's precision, lay a shadow neither diplomacy nor steel could banish. Because this was never just about defeating Russia. It was about becoming undeniable. They called it progress. Rails forged across rice fields, smokestacks piercing the sky like new shrines to a mechanical god, children reciting science in foreign accents. But for every steel beam raised, something ancient was buried without ceremony. Not destroyed, not outlawed, just unspoken, like a name lost in the echo of a renamed street. The Japan that emerged from the Meiji crucible was faster, louder, stronger, but it also walked with a limp no census could record. Listen carefully, and you can still hear them: ghosts in the machinery. The lacquered whispers of artisans whose crafts no longer fit factory schedules. The soft rustle of monks whose temples now stood in the shadow of rail depots. The silence of mothers who stitched Western uniforms by oil lamp, unlearning lullabies in favor of state anthems. These weren't the enemies of modernity. They were simply caught on the wrong side of the tide, fixed stars in a sky that had begun to rotate violently. In one fishing village outside Kobe, the old men stopped telling stories. Not from bitterness, but from futility. Their grandchildren didn't speak the dialect anymore. They spoke the language of engineers, of blueprints and boiler rooms. They didn't ask about fox spirits or the etiquette of tea. They asked how to wire copper, how to calculate tonnage. The old men complied, nodding politely, and sat with their silence. That silence is also history, not printed in textbooks, but real, bleeding into the soil. Even Shinto, the sole thread of Japan for centuries, was reassembled into something legible to bureaucrats. Forest shrines became tourist stops. Sacred rites were folded into schedules. The divine was not abandoned, but it was demoted. No longer a wild, uncontrollable essence within nature and bloodlines, but a sanctioned symbol, tamed for nation building. In a rush to catch the West, Japan didn't erase its gods. It filed them into paperwork. The tragedy was not just loss. It was misrecognition. A generation born under electric light looked into the mirror and mistook imitation for identity. To wear a frock coat, to sign treaties in French, to build a navy of ironclads. These were triumphs, yes, but they were also masks, worn so tightly that some forgot they were ever masks at all. A poem scribbled in a student's notebook in 1899 reads, "I do not know where my ancestors walk, only where the trains go. It is not a protest, It is a confession, an elegy disguised as observation. That is what the Meiji Era did best. It moved so quickly that mourning had to masquerade as marvel. We remember the miracle, but we rarely pause for the funeral. The funeral of 1,000 small Japans that once coexisted in chaotic, sacred contradiction. The one where a swordsmith's hammer rang beside a monk's bell, where a father taught his son how to bow not just in greeting, but in reverence. That Japan did not vanish in a single decree. It was edited away line by line from daily life, until it could only be glimpsed in dreams and old songs no longer sung. And yet, reverence remains, not for nostalgia, but for the weight of the cost. Because to understand what was gained, we must also honor what was sacrificed. Transformation is never clean. It's not a ladder, it's a crucible. What emerges may be stronger, more dazzling, more feared, but it carries the fingerprints of what burned to make it. So we ask, not what Japan became, but what Japan had to become instead of. Not just what it built, but what it buried. The clang of the Meiji forge was not just the sound of steel being bent into rail lines and rifles. It was the sound of memory being hardened, reshaped, and recast for permanence. A nation that once wrote its identity in brushstrokes on rice paper began inscribing it into iron hulls, smokestacks, and the gears of a machinery that would not forget. Memory, once fluid, became mechanical, and in that transformation, there was both power and loss. Steel is indifferent to mythology. It does not remember cherry blossoms or temple bells. It remembers pressure, heat, force, the materials of war and industry. And yet, Japan dared to use that same steel not only to build battleships, but to etch a story of survival deeper than any scroll or shrine. One that would not decay in the rain. You can still feel it, this memory written in steel. If you stand beneath the riveted arches of Tokyo Station, or run your hand across the frame of a steam locomotive that once cut through landscapes that barely had roads. These were not just tools. They were declarations, symbols. Proof that Japan had crossed the threshold from being studied by the West to being watched by it. But here is the paradox: the more durable the material, the more brittle the soul can become. Memory written in steel is sharp-edged. It does not yield to doubt. It resists interpretation. The Meiji transformation was not merely remembered. It was weaponized, used to justify ambition, used to silence dissent, used to flatten nuance beneath the weight of destiny. In the name of national glory, the memory of suffering was filed away in steel cabinets. The child conscripted to a textile mill, a footnote. The sword passed down for 5 generations, melted to make railroad bolts. Progress. The dialects lost in the name of uniform education. An acceptable price. Still, steel does not forget. It carries ghosts in its weld lines. You can see it in the photographs. Portraits of young men in European uniforms, backs straight, eyes uncertain. In the factories where women worked 12-hour shifts so their sons could learn trigonometry and their husbands could drill for empire. In the rusting hulls of ships that once flew the rising sun and now sleep beneath the ocean, their memory written in salt. What Japan achieved in 50 years was staggering. A civilizational somersault, a time-bending leap across centuries. But to leap like that is to leave part of yourself midair, suspended, unlanded. The Meiji legacy is both a triumph and a wound, one sutured not in silk or scripture, but in steel. And so, we remember not just what was built, but what it meant to build it. We look not just at the finished form, but at the furnace that shaped it. Steel is honest. It shows its scars. It does not hide where it bent, or cracked, or held fast when it should have broken. In this way, it is a perfect metaphor for the nation that wielded it, unflinching, unyielding, but not untouched. A memory written in steel is not silent. It hums in the wires, echoes in the train tracks, endures in the architecture. It says we survived. And also we changed. And also, if you're willing to listen closely enough, it whispers we paid for it. But if steel remembers, then we must ask, what did it forget? It forgot the softness of tatami straw under the weight of slow mornings. It forgot the brushwork of grandfathers who inked poetry by lantern light. It forgot the hum of lullabies sung through sliding paper doors. Steel moves forward. It does not look back. It has no room for ghosts. And yet, Japan's soul was never a relic to be buried. It was a current to be rerouted, pressured through valves and boilers, redirected through smokestacks and policy. What we call modernization was, in many ways, a ritual of erasure. Not just of things, but of ways. The rhythm of seasons replaced by factory shifts. The intimacy of community substituted with bureaucratic anonymity. A nation once bound by shared mythologies now bound by schedules, patents, telegraphs, tariffs, faster, stronger, more precise, but less known to itself. And still, in the shadow of locomotives and telegraph lines, something pulsed, faint but insistent. A heartbeat not fully extinguished, a ritual still performed in secret. A story passed down, mouth to ear, even if the steel didn't care to listen. You can see it in how Japan blended its progress. How even the sharpest modern edge carried a lacquer of the old world. Brick schools built to Western spec, but aligned to catch cherry blossom breezes. Steamships painted in Imperial Navy gray, yet blessed with Shinto ceremony before launch. A paradox not resolved, but inhabited. This is the Meiji Miracle's haunting brilliance. It did not simply replace the old with the new. It layered them, like sediment pressed into geological time. A samurai's sword melted down to forge a factory gate, a Zen silence echoing beneath the noise of coal-fired dynamos. Memory fossilized not in silence, but in friction. Even today, steel echoes. It is in the rails of the Shinkansen and the girders of Tokyo's skyline. But now, we hear more clearly what it whispers, that survival came at the cost of fragmentation, that gain was shadowed by grief, that progress was forged with the flame of forgotten names. And still, somehow, it endured, not as perfection, but as balance, as contradiction lived out in the open, as a soul no longer afraid to be broken and reforged. At the close of an age rewritten by coal, cartridge, and constitution, Japan stood at an impossible axis, looking forward, yet never ceasing to glance behind. It had torn itself apart to reassemble something untested, not a replica of the West, nor a shadow of its past, but a strange, luminous hybrid born of contradiction. A mirror nation that dreamt in both directions, into the mythic haze of what it had been, and the blinding incandescence of what it dared to become. This dreaming was not delusion, nor nostalgia. It was a form of national survival. In every shrine untouched by railway expansion, in every school where Confucian values whispered through European pedagogy, in every bow given before a steamship's hull, there was a refusal to become unrecognizable to oneself. Modernity was not a clean slate. It was a palimpsest. Beneath every innovation lay the ghost, script of older truths. And it is here, in that uneasy layering, that we find the deeper rhythm of Japan's transformation. Not just a sprint toward industry, but a choreography of inheritance and invention, conflict and compromise. The paradox was not hidden, it was ritualized. A general bowed like a courtier, a financier consulted ancestral spirits before launching a banking reform. The emperor wore Western regalia atop a throne still framed by ancient pine. At first glance, it was camouflage. But in time, it became something richer, a language of duality. A way to live modern life without entirely discarding the spiritual compass of a pre-modern world. And yet, this dual dreaming came at a cost. To live in two temporalities at once is to be always dislocated, never fully home in either. Some found awe in the velocity of progress. Others found grief in its silence. Children memorized algebra in German textbooks, while their grandparents spoke in the dialects of lost provinces. The distance between generations stretched not by decades, but by civilizational epochs compressed into single lifetimes. Where once lineage anchored identity, now it frayed at the edge of rail lines and foreign factories. Still, even amid dissonance, there were moments of deep coherence. When Japanese woodblock artists began mimicking Western perspective, and then surpassed it. When Kyoto artisans mechanized looms, but dyed silk with ancient, painstaking pigments. When Japanese engineers designed locomotives not just to move bodies, but to honor landscape. Progress became poetry, because it remembered, because it ached, to become modern without becoming hollow. That was the Meiji Miracle's deeper alchemy. Not a tale of triumph, but of tension mastered. A blade tempered, not by rejecting heat, but by learning how much it could endure without breaking. And so Japan carried its paradoxes forward, not resolved, but alive. Even now, in its cities of neon and discipline, of quiet rituals in bullet train stations, the Meiji echo lingers. You feel it in the hush that descends before a tea ceremony in a skyscraper boardroom, in the scent of ink and metal, in the national memory that still dreams simultaneously of emperors and entrepreneurs, of bamboo and bandwidth. This is what it means for a nation to dream in both directions, not simply to remember, and not merely to rush ahead, but to fold time inward like origami, until the past becomes a foundation, not a chain. Until the soul is not what is lost in change, but what gives change its shape. In the eyes of the outside world, Japan's metamorphosis looked impossibly clean. A flicker, a before and after. The woodblock empire transformed into a steel, breathed superpower as if by sleight of hand. Western observers, awestruck or anxious, wrote headlines thick with wonder. The Oriental enigma modernizes. A nation awakes. Samurai to statesman in a single generation. But what the world saw was only the silhouette, never the shadows it cast. What they missed was the murmur beneath the march, the grief folded into the gears. The world applauded a rising industrial colossus, but did not hear the silence of vanished dialects, or notice the absence of hairlines thinned by labor. They saw ships, not the children who welded their hulls before they could spell their names. They marveled at soldiers in Prussian, cut uniforms, without seeing the funeral kimono folded quietly at home for the samurai who could no longer serve. The world saw speed. It did not see cost. Because transformation in its deepest form is quiet. It does not shout. It bleeds into routines. Into the way tea is sipped faster. Into the new timbre of a teacher's voice trained in a foreign tongue. Into the calendar rearranged to match global finance, not lunar faces. These aren't revolutions of flags. They're revolutions of breath, gesture, and gaze. Imperceptible shifts in how a people understand themselves when they no longer recognize their reflection in history's mirror. And yet, the mirror was there. Only now it fractured. What the world missed, what it was perhaps never meant to see, was how Japan endured this dissonance without falling apart. How it mastered duality not through resolution but through ritual. A schoolboy reciting French law code still bowed before his elders. A mother praying at a Shinto shrine still wrapped factory wages in paper before placing them at the family altar. The contradiction was never erased. It was unfolded, not solved, held, but the world was trained to read empire through emblems. And Japan, in its modern garb, became legible only in the terms others had already written. To the West, it was either mimic or menace, an eager pupil or an emerging predator. Rarely was it permitted to be what it truly was, a survivor, reconstructing itself from the inside out, using borrowed tools to carve a wholly original soul. This was the deeper illusion that Japan's success was a replication of Western progress. It wasn't. It was a reckoning. A refusal to disappear. A civilization daring to rewrite the arc of modernity without erasing its name from the prologue. And though the world mistook it for assimilation, it was in fact an insurgency of subtlety, where endurance masqueraded as compliance, and the quiet re-engineering of identity occurred beneath the radar of imperial gaze. For those who watched only with their eyes, Meiji Japan was a spectacle. For those who listened with their hearts, it was a song, a strange, aching harmony of ruin and revival, sung in a key the world had forgotten how to hear. There are places in modern Japan where the old spirit still lingers, not in monuments or museums, but in muscle memory. The way a craftsman pauses before the final hammer strike. The silence between bow and reply. The unspoken duty folded into morning routines. These are not echoes of nostalgia. They are the marrow of a soul that refused to vanish beneath the engines of change. The Meiji Miracle was never just about trains, treaties, or textiles. It was a reforging of identity under the pressure of time so compressed it scorched. And what remains today, beneath neon cities and surgical punctuality, are scars that hum like tuning forks, frequencies not always heard but deeply felt. Take the face of the salaryman, disciplined, resolute, exhausted. He is not the samurai, yet something of the samurai endures in him. Not the sword, but the sacrifice. Not the top knot, but the code. The post-Meiji soul had to rehouse its nobility. Not in battlefield honor, but in unrelenting labor, social cohesion, and quiet duty. The battlefield became the boardroom. The katana, a commuter pass. And what of the women? The mothers of iron, whose revolution never made it to the scrolls of state. Their silence was never surrender. It was transcription. They bore the dual weight of tradition and transformation, raising children who would inhabit a world unrecognizable to their own parents. They translated pain into preparation, memory into resolve. The most haunting question that trails behind all this is simple: what did Japan become? Not in metrics or milestones, but in the marrow. What does it mean to be modern if it means forever holding your ancestors in one hand and your ambition in the other, neither allowed to fall? In Tokyo's digital arteries and Kyoto's fading alleys, you feel it, that tension, that grace. The sword and the steam engine still speaking through the hum of the bullet train. In a single day, a child bows before a shrine and scrolls through AI textbooks in the same breath. This is not contradiction. This is coherence born of trauma, unity forged through velocity. Modernity did not erase Japan. It fractured it, refracted it, then rewove it, like kintsugi, the art of broken pottery stitched together with gold. Every rupture is visible, but every break is part of the design. The beauty is not in what was lost. The beauty is in how Japan carried those losses forward, not as burdens but as warnings, as wisdom. The modern Japanese soul is not a product. It is an echo chamber. Inside it resound the chants of monks, the clatter of factories, the lullabies of dislocated mothers, and the precise silence before a martial arts kata begins. It is in essence the memory of motion, never still, never settled, always balancing between reverence and reinvention. If the world mistook Japan for having become something else, it is only because it didn't listen closely enough. The story was never one of abandonment. It was one of translation, of a people who refused to forget, even as they raced into a future so fast it threatened to erase them. Even now, if you walk through the heart of a Japanese city at dawn, before the traffic, before the neon hum, there is a kind of hush that isn't silence but memory catching its breath. Concrete towers stand like sentinels over ancient shrines. Office workers in pressed suits pass beneath gates, once meant for spirits. Time hasn't vanished here. It has layered. And in the folds between progress and prayer, you feel it, the quiet insistence that nothing was truly lost, only transformed. The soul of Meiji Japan did not dissolve when the swords were surrendered or the kimono set aside. It adapted. It moved into rail lines and factory sirens, into the rituals of mass production and mass education, into efficiency and discipline, and 1,000 bows given not out of submission, but continuity, into the language of steel and ceremony, whispered in code through generations. In post-war rebirth, as Japan hurtled into its second great transformation, this time not imperial, but industrial, the echoes grew stranger, some of them fractured. In the clamor of assembly lines and corporate loyalty, something once poetic risked becoming procedural. Work became worship. Nationhood, a performance of perfection. Yet even within the algorithm of modernity, the old cadence pulsed, just beneath the circuitry. There is no tragedy in evolution unless it forgets its source. Japan, despite the pressure to perform, never fully did. Beneath the skyscrapers in Shinkansen lies a country still dreaming with the voice of its ancestors. The sound of a bamboo wind chime in a Tokyo alley. The soft clack of Gita shoes echoing in a narrow Kyoto lane. The taste of pickled plum passed from mother to daughter. These are not tokens of a vanished time. They are fragments of code, keeping the soul legible across generations of change, even its modern contradictions. Robotic caretakers in temples, Zen gardens beside neon arcades, are not failures of cohesion, but proof of an old dream retold in a new language. Japan doesn't split itself between past and future. It speaks in both. Like a tree fed by ancient roots, flowering in the high-frequency pulse of global commerce, it refuses to choose between reverence and relevance. The world often misunderstands this. It sees the precision but not the poetry, the quiet but not the will. It marvels at the innovation and misses the inner negotiation that sustains it. The warrior spirit didn't vanish, it shape-shifted. The sacrifice didn't end, it was privatized. The mirrors remain, but they reflect more than imitation now. They hold the weight of choice. Japan's modern soul is a paradox, soft-edged yet unyielding, ancient in instinct and futuristic in form. It carries the burden of centuries without spectacle, and in doing so, it offers something rare, a model not of power but of poise. The ability to survive not by forgetting who you were, but by becoming what your memory demanded of you. That is the final miracle. Not victory, not wealth, but identity endured, not preserved in amber, but recast in motion. They called it a miracle, but miracles don't sweat. Miracles don't leave the scent of scorched silk in the air or bury centuries beneath the clatter of coal-fed forges. What happened in Japan between 1868 and the early 20th century wasn't divine intervention. It was a controlled burn, fierce, deliberate, sacrificial. And now, standing more than a century removed, the legacy isn't just what rose from the ash. It's the ash itself. What it cost to shine so quickly, so fiercely. The Meiji Restoration was never about merely catching up. It was about staying alive. A dying world does not quietly wait to be overtaken. It screams into the future. Japan heard that scream and made it strategy. The samurai became bureaucrats. Shrines stood beside smokestacks. Children learned arithmetic in German uniforms and ethics in Confucian whispers. It was not contradiction. It was coexistence forced into urgency. The miracle wasn't that Japan became powerful. The miracle was that it didn't unravel while doing so. But what do you inherit when your ancestors traded the past for propulsion? For many, the answer came not in words, but in textures. The cold chrome of a commuter train, gliding silently past a rice field. The hymn of factory sirens merging with the cicadas of summer. The rigid bow of a salaryman echoing the form of a forgotten retainer. There are patterns here, rituals made of residue. The habits of warriors reincarnated as work ethic. The harmony of village life replaced by corporate fealty. Duty remained. Only the object shifted. And yet, no transition of this scale arrives cleanly. Some memories were amputated to make room for machinery. Oral histories silenced by the hum of dynamos. Regional dialects extinguished under national curriculums. Names rewritten, temples turned into rail depots. Mothers sent sons into mines instead of monasteries. Daughters sent west in ideas, east in loyalty, caught between textile looms and foreign textbooks. The sacrifice wasn't only blood. It was the distortion of belonging. But the legacy of the Meiji Miracle is not just what was lost. It is also what was learned, painfully, skillfully, often silently. It taught that identity can be porous without being erased. That a sword melted into a plowshare still remembers the heat of battle. That borrowing does not equal surrender. If you know how to pay back with reinvention. Japan did not simply westernize, it metabolized. It broke down the world's offerings into something singular, a civilization that wears contradiction like a kimono. Layered, elegant, tightly bound but flexible enough to move. Today, that legacy pulses through more than policy or posture. It lives in the code of resilience. In the way disasters are met with dignity. In how a bowed head can carry both shame and strength. In the willingness to work 1,000 hours not just for profit, but for place. In the music, in the architecture, in the silence between trains. Meiji echoes in everything, even if the name is no longer spoken aloud. And maybe that's the final sign of true transformation, not that it ends with triumph, but that it endures in subtleties. It does not demand to be remembered. It simply insists on being felt. The legacy of the Meiji Miracle is not in the steel it forged, but in the soul it tempered.